Hi, I'm Tony Johnson. I've been a proud member of the Truman National Security Project since 2013. It's my pleasure to spend a few minutes today to tell you how I feel about Truman, talk about why the voice of Truman and its members is so important, and to share with you my perspective on Truman's future. I joined Truman in 2013 looking to sharpen my national security skills and expand my professional network. I found what I was looking for: a community of progressive foreign policy and national security professionals working to develop and advance big ideas that will drive and shape U.S. security policy for the 21st century. I also discovered an amazing community of friends and colleagues. But more importantly, I found a calling. In 2013, I co-founded True Diversity with my good friend Dr. Rachel Gillum. Together, we created a space to amplify and promote the voices of members of color, create greater diversity throughout our ranks, and to impact the ongoing dialogue regarding national security. I'm proud to say that the Truman community supported us with open arms, and it's fair to say that I've rarely been prouder to be part of any organization. Now more than ever, the diverse voices of Truman members is vitally important to our national security, both at home and abroad. The United States cannot expect to have a strong foreign policy on the back of a weak domestic policy. I am confident Truman will continue to seek and nurture diverse voices and create a stronger community of national security experts. It's been my honor to be part of Truman, and I look forward to the great work ahead of us. Thank you.
Please welcome the President and CEO of the Truman Center for National Policy, Jenna Ben-Yehuda.
Good morning, and welcome to the first day of TruCon, the annual conference of the Truman Center for National Policy. We're so glad you could join us for this series of urgent conversations. I know just how valuable your time and your energy are, especially now, and I'm so grateful to you for spending it with us. This year, we convene online, not in person, as we have for over 15 years. This change is one small thread in our current national narrative. That story is as stark as it is tragic. In the last year, we have had to come to grips with some very large numbers. 200,000, the number of Americans dead from coronavirus. 7 million, the number of Americans who contracted the virus, many of whom will suffer its consequences for years to come. 40 million, the number of Americans who lost their jobs. Added to this horror is the knowledge that this did not have to be our fate. Countries we once helped rebuild, Germany, Korea, have fared far better than we have. Most of the rest of the world has fared better. As we pass 1 million deaths worldwide, we must note, in sorrow and in anger, that the US, which includes less than 5% of the world's population, has suffered 20% of the world's COVID deaths. We know it didn't have to be this way. The story of our country over the past year has also burned a roster of names into the national imagination. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. The list goes on. Racism stains our national fabric more visibly now than ever before. The measure of our country will be what it's always been: what we do about it. Thankfully, we have also seen slender rays of hope, both in other numbers and in certain names. Here's a number I'm excited about: 37. It's the percentage of the voting population that is millennial or Gen Z, now the largest bloc. 350,000, the number of poll workers registered by Power the Polls just this year. And then there are the names we've learned and lauded this year: Fiona Hill, Jacinda Ardern, Alexander Vindman, who we'll be hearing from tomorrow as he accepts the first Truman Award for exceptional moral courage in public service. Because 2020 is a year in which we needed such an award, and it is also a year in which there were many deserving of such an honor. We would be remiss if we forgot that there have been heroes and victories in this most stressful and tumultuous year. 2020 began in flames, the actual flames that burned in Australia and devastated so much of the country. And those flames have continued. We are watching the largest fires in California's history, and we are confronting a president who every day fans the flames of racism and xenophobia with an arsonist's abandon. When we step back from the details of the story, what we see is a narrative theme of a multitude of injustices that are part of a wider attack. Attacks on democratic values, both in the US and overseas. Attacks on values enshrined in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Values like the rule of law and a respect for human rights and the norms, unwritten yet indispensable, that sustain them. These are the values the US has promoted overseas, and we now find them under siege at home. Though we recognize too that for Black and Brown communities, for marginalized populations, that yawning gap has existed for years. And the world, which for so long looked to our nation as a beacon and an example, now looks to us with pity and even disgust. Recent polls show major erosion of views of the US, even amongst our staunchest, most long-standing allies. In order to maintain US power and influence, we must reverse that trend. We must confront a world in which we no longer sit apart or atop, as Jim Goldgeier notes in his recent Foreign Affairs article, but rather alongside. And global engagement, not as a hegemon, but in many respects as a peer, will require of us a humility many will find foreign. It will require focus, hard choices, some restraint, and a lot of listening. Serving US interests in this new moment will require us to finally shatter the barriers we've placed between our domestic agenda and our foreign policy. We may be at home in the world. We must be at home in the world, just as COVID made it to our shores in an afternoon's transatlantic flight, and as California's fires made DC's skies hazy just days later. So too must we recognize that our broader national security challenges are the ones we also face at home. Climate change, the pernicious underbelly of technology, real tests to democratic governance. One of those tests is rampant disinformation, and the issue is global. It's driven anti-Muslim violence in Burma and far-right violence in Europe, and it's turned up in the guise of racist and anti-Semitic full-page ads in Spanish-language newspapers in South Florida. At Truman, we have long recognized that interconnectedness. Our nationwide network of extraordinary national security professionals live along those seams. These are the lessons the national security community has worked long and hard to learn abroad, and we have so much to share at home. And it's why this current moment, for all its perils, for all the sadness and the rage, it's one where Trumans are making a difference nationally and in our communities across our 16 chapters around the country. And I hope for those of you who are new to Truman that you like what you see here. And if you do, please head to trumancenter.org to apply for membership. Our applications open in February for our 2021 class. And if you're able, please consider donating. Your support makes all of these ideas and all of this work possible. I'd like to thank at this point the sponsors who make our work possible and enable us to convene over the next 4 days. MITRE, Lockheed Martin, Exec Online, the Open Society Foundations, the Beacon Fund, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Compton Foundation, the Sandler Foundation, and Plowshares Fund. I'd also like to thank our boards of directors under the leadership of Stephen Bailey, Chair of Truman Center, and John Driscoll, Chair of Truman Project. They have been outstanding partners, and I'm so grateful for their counsel and stewardship. To all of you who give to Truman, thank you. The thing about a moment of destruction and despair is that it offers a wide berth for imagination. So over the next 2 days, at the public days of our conference, we will engage with some of this nation's greatest thinkers as we come together to reimagine American global leadership. We're so honored to have with us Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes from Wisconsin, as we explore the interconnectedness between our domestic needs and global leadership. We'll also feature outstanding panels on immigration, climate, and disinformation with nationally recognized experts. And you'll get to know some of our remarkable members. Together, we can build a more just, peaceful, and deeply inclusive world. So please, grab that next cup of coffee and settle in. We have a lot to talk about, and we need you here for all of it. Welcome to the future we can build together. Welcome to TruCon.
Hi everyone, my name is Coda Rayo Garza. I'm a 2018 Truman political partner. I'm delighted to be here today with you to share a little bit about my story of self and a little bit about the things that I've done since 2018 when I joined Truman. But I'm especially honored to be here today in part representing my Latino brothers and sisters who are still underrepresented in this space, but in many other spaces within our country. Since 2018, I have continued the work of a scholar, activist, of a writer and educator, teaching the true non-whitewashed history of the development of our democracy and her institutions. I have gone on to see my students graduate college, find amazing jobs, but most importantly, remain engaged in our democracy. In 2019, I took an opportunity. A special election was called by the Texas governor, and I decided that it was time that a woman represent this district that hadn't been represented in over 15 years by a woman. I was one of 5 candidates, the only woman and the only Latina in that race, and that matters because representation matters for a democracy, period. While I came within 28 votes of making the runoff, I didn't walk away empty-handed because I walked away with the experience or with having experienced a democratic exercise running for office that still too many of us minority groups have yet to experience. And so I say all of that because everything that has happened thereafter has been a phenomenal expression, but an everlasting justification as to why now more than ever we must continue to defend our democracy. Since 2019, I have received awards and been appointed to commissions and joined CFR. But to me, all of those things are important because they chip away at chronically and formally homologous spaces, right? Again, representation matters. But my journey began in the borderlands. It began in the frontera. I'm a native of Laredo, Texas, and I grew up on the literal fringes of our country along the Rio Grande, where the manifestation of our country's foreign and domestic policies coalesce and often fail some of the most vulnerable communities in the state and in the country. I grew up in a colonia where the concept of a militarized border had crept into our neighborhood long before, and watching my neighbors and friends deported and wondering, will that one day be one of us, is a sad memory that fuels the work that I'm doing now and the work that I've been doing in advocating for vulnerable communities. Um, the socioeconomic mobility rate for a place like the one where I grew up in is not very promising. But I'll forever remember the voice of my mother and father who said to me, échale ganas a la escuela, no vas a tener que vivir como nosotros. It was the idea that in this country there was an opportunity to build up. So I hung on to that. And, I'm grateful that that became a truth for me. But I am sad that it wasn't without going against the grains of a system that wasn't designed to benefit people like me. And so, yet again, more fuel for the work that I do now. Truman played a critical role in the path that I forged for myself since 2018. See, I don't have to reiterate to many of you what you already know, that it's important to diversify the voices of people writing the policies, of the people making the decisions at the top, to strive towards equity by ensuring a truly representative space in every corner of our country, because then a truly representative democracy will follow. But especially of the voices in our foreign policy spaces, where national security now more than ever is domestic security for our most vulnerable Americanos. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out how Truman, specifically in the beginning, Shannon, and now Brent, have been critical to helping me get my voice heard through my writing and my op-eds. I am ever grateful for this support that I've received from Truman. So as I close this small share out, I invite you to commit to three things. One, to listen to others, especially vulnerable and underrepresented communities when we're doing our work, whether it's in politics, policy, academia, security. Two, to recognize our own privilege of being in this space where we are now. And three, to find solutions that don't use the same thinking that we used in the past that gave us the mistakes we had. I will close off by, wishing each of you much success. And here's to democracy.
Hey, Truman, it's John Driscoll here. I'm the longtime chair of the Truman National Security Project. Welcome to TruCon. I couldn't be prouder of everything that Truman has accomplished. I joined 15 years ago, and our hope was that we would get people, progressives, who cared about our hard power, our soft power, were true patriots and interested in defending and extending our values, more engaged in politics. And to have so many people in state and local office, in Congress, gosh, we even had a presidential candidate this year. Eventually, we're going to win that one. Is super inspiring and validating for what we committed to, which was to commit to American values, and that those values would not end at the edge of our national territory. We could not be getting together in a more important year. Now, I'm also a captain in the U.S. Army Reserve, I'm a retired captain in the U.S. Army Reserve, and I made a solemn commitment to defend our Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. And this year, the enemies in the open are engaged in our politics and undermining our power and our people abroad. There is no more important battle than this campaign and the campaigns that follow. Engagement now and engagement continuing through the election. I know all of you have committed to work hard to defend Truman values. It is even more important that you dig deeper, work harder, make a few more phone calls, and engage even more in the fierce urgency of this election. Our very constitutional republic is at risk. We're up against a group of people who are trying to undermine the military, erode and undermine our alliances, contest basic values, and even the basics, commitments to democracy and to the institutions of our republic. Remember, this year more than ever, Harry Truman's challenge to all of us that don't let the enemy take the battle to you, take the battle to them, put them on the defensive, and never apologize for what you stand for.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan DeLuce with NBC News, and I'm pleased to have Congressman Joaquin Castro today to talk about U.S. foreign policy and how it relates to domestic issues in the lives of Americans. Congressman Castro represents the 20th District in Texas. He's a graduate of Stanford and Harvard Law School. He is a member of the House Intelligence Committee, and he is vice chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, chairman of the House Foreign Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, and also is head of the U.S.-Japan caucus, which will be very apropos to our discussion today. So welcome to Congressman Castro.
Great to be with you and great to be with everybody from the National Security Project.
Well, I thought we'd start today's discussion with the fact that you're a candidate for the possible chairmanship of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You are not the most senior ranking in terms of years in office in your fourth term, and you're seen as a progressive voice. So I thought it would be good to just start with what would you try to bring to that job, and maybe how you might do it differently than it's been done in the past. And one aspect of that job is there's a tradition, as you know, of bipartisanship. Even in this time, the ranking Republican, Congressman McCall and Congressman Engel, the outgoing chairman, had a cooperative relationship for the most part, I think most people would say. And there's also criticism of Congress that it's perhaps not sufficiently rigorous in its oversight when it's the same party on the Hill and in the White House. So just tell us a little bit about what you would like to bring to that job.
Yeah, no, well, thank you very much for the question. A few things. Well, let's start with the race itself and how I've approached it. You know, the chair, whether it's foreign affairs or appropriations, energy and commerce, whatever it may be, for the folks that follow particular caucus races, they're usually very behind closed doors affairs. They're conversations ordinarily on the House floor, but obviously because of the pandemic, it's more phone calls now, member-to-member conversations. And so what I've tried to do in this race is establish a new standard of transparency and equity for the people who seek to be chair, hopefully not only of foreign affairs, but of any of the committees in the Congress, because although only the Democratic caucus members will get to vote next term on who the new chair will be, you all know the consequences for who becomes chair and that person's vision for the issues they want to take on and what they want to spotlight and so forth has tremendous consequences, not only for the Democratic caucus or the Congress, but really for the American people. And so in that spirit, I've tried to open this process up. I've done now more than half a dozen town halls just like this one with different groups. There's one probably about a month ago now, for example, where there were about 100 mostly progressive groups that were represented, and we did about an hour-long Q&A conversation, because I think that's what everybody in the public, that's what advocates, for example, who work on these issues full-time, I think that's what people deserve from somebody who seeks to be chair of a committee in the Congress, is to be able to ask them questions about what their vision is and where they want to take the committee. And then same thing with the, one thing that I've spoken to the Democratic caucus chair about, Hakeem Jeffries, is having a kind of forum where the candidates for foreign affairs, chair of foreign affairs, stand up there and take questions from the committee, from the congressional members about, again, those same issues. what their priorities are and where they want to take the committee. And so what I would do is you ask the question, well, what would you do differently, or how would you treat the committee? I think that what we have to do is use the committee to put diplomacy first. Look, I think all hoping for a Biden win in November. So hopefully we have a new president in January, and the legislative branch have to do two things simultaneously. Number one, stand up for its own constitutional authority, particularly when it comes to war powers. But at the same time, if Vice President Biden becomes president, work with the president to reestablish America as a North Star around the world on the things that we've stood for generations: freedom, democracy, human rights, rooting out corruption, the things that have earned us respect around the world. And the perception of America as a North Star has diminished incredibly over these 4 short years. And so I would do everything that I could to be a partner with the executive branch on that. For example, very quickly, we would organize a series of codels among the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the larger Congress to go out to our allies and let them know that essentially America is back, that we intend to be a North Star again on these things. I would also be more inclusive with the members of Congress in terms of the topics and the subjects that we take on with the committee, and the witnesses that we call in front of the witness table. I believe there are a lot of well-qualified folks whose expertise we drawn upon in Congress and called to the witness table, and I did work on that this term. So there are a lot of issues that we need to take on, obviously, but those are some of the important structural changes that I would make. And then, Ed, I think our focus should be on diplomacy first, on repealing the AUMFs, for example, reclaiming our constitutional powers, and that's going to be a very ambitious undertaking in the next year.
Thank you. I wanted to just follow up on running the committee. Would you see bipartisanship as also a priority or a tradition that you think needs to continue? Could you see doing markups of bills where there's not a consensus, where there's not a bipartisan consensus?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Since I got into Congress about 8 years ago now, I've had the fortune of serving on 3 committees that were fairly bipartisan. The last one I mentioned, kind of went downward, but Armed Services Force and then the Intelligence Committee, obviously around the time of the Russia investigation, that went sideways. First 2 in particular have been very bipartisan, and I think that's been generally a good thing for the United States and for the Congress. I do think that there's an important distinction to make between bipartisanship and consensus versus unanimity. I certainly believe that we should encourage bipartisanship, that we should even encourage consensus. But the standard that won't hold the committee to is absolute unanimity, where one Republican or 1 or 2 conservatives essentially have a veto power over the policies that we want to pursue. Now, I say that as somebody who has worked with Mike McCall, who's the ranking member on Foreign Affairs now, on cybersecurity issues. I was able a few years ago to get an important piece of legislation that I had rolled into his cybersecurity bill. I worked with Representative Curtis this term on Hong legislation, for example. I even worked earlier this term, before he went to the White House, with Mark Meadows, who was the head of the Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus, on global democracy legislation. So I've done bipartisan work. At the same time, we can't give any 1 or 2 members of the committee a veto over every single thing that we might consider doing.
You talked about the idea of if Biden wins the election, that America is back, that would be kind of an effort to put that message out. But that does beg a question. Do you see what comes next? Is if Biden is elected, is it essentially a restoration of many of the policies that were pursued under President Obama? Or do you favor a more fresh approach, a more of a break with the past, not just with the Obama years, but even before that? And that, do you see a kind of more progressive vision where U.S. military commitments are changed or scaled back? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has to be a fresh start. I think it has to be where we've learned lessons from mistakes that we've made in the past, that we're willing to make sometimes significant changes and adjustments based on what we've learned in the past. And to answer your question, it's not a matter of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. We have to be willing to do something different. Now, let me, I guess, go back a little bit and give some context to that answer. I think in the immediate aftermath of the election, which I'm hoping for a clear Biden victory so that there's no election contest, no shenanigans, anything from the president. That hope may be beyond really, what's reasonable at this point. But certainly that's what we're working for and hoping for. But let's assume first that Joe Biden is installed as president on January 20th of next year. What the executive branch is going to have to do, working with the legislative branch, is first, I think, a damage assessment of the exact damage that has been done by the administration at the State Department, where morale is near an all-time low, getting tougher, where less people are taking the Foreign Service exam, where diversity continues to be incredibly lackluster. Damage assessment of what's happened over the last 4 years. At the same time, lessons learned about what we learned Obama years and even before that, and what we would do differently. And I believe that the folks who are close to President, many of whom experienced or served during the Obama-Biden years, themselves have their own sense of what we need to do differently. So I would like to work with the new president and the administration on a place where we put diplomacy first and where military use of force is not our first instinct. President Trump, for example, pitched himself as somebody who was going to end the forever wars. At the same time, just recently we had more troops deployed than the beginning of President Trump's term. So we really have to dig in and figure out how we're going to do things so that diplomacy rather than the military is our first option.
That's a great jumping off point. Let's talk about how that works in practice with a few examples. So, for example, in Iraq, should the U.S. have troops in Iraq, or is it time to withdraw them because the threat from the Islamic State has diminished? Should the U.S. have the small force that it does have in Syria? There are arguments that both Obama and Trump have ceded ground to Russia or other adversaries. So let's start with that. Is that a place where would that be?
Well, sure. And why don't we start with a very concrete example and something that I supported. There was an amendment that Ilhan Omar had last NDAA, for example, two important amendments actually, but one of them was hers, I'm trying to remember if it was a part of NDAA or a standalone piece of legislation, but I think it was an amendment to accomplish a drawdown next year, I believe, in Afghanistan, right? And so I supported her legislation, on that, and that's consistent with what I believe is that, for example, there was a declaration that ISIS had been defeated in Iraq, and so we have to fundamentally ask ourselves what is our continuing purpose in that nation? And same thing with Syria. During President Trump's administration, I think, have gotten even more chaotic there. But we have to fundamentally ask ourselves, what is the role of the United States in these nations, and whether our presence is really contributing to the good of the country and also to the stability of the United States and its allies. And so, that's have to figure out early on in the Biden administration.
What about using the threat of U.S. military force? That has also been a kind of bipartisan tradition, whether it's in discussions in diplomacy with North Korea regarding their weapons programs, or Iran. The threat of force has always been looming over U.S. discussions with Iran even before Trump entered office. Is that something that should continue? Is that the way the U.S. should conduct itself?
I think with Iran, for example, first of all, I think we should get back into the Iran nuclear agreement. And our objectives have to be clear. And we shouldn't be, earlier, for example, maybe in the last few months, that I don't want us to kick ass just to kick ass. And that would be the same thing with threats of use of military force. Now, look, I think the world understands that the United States has the strongest military of any nation in the world. And so, that said, when we threaten to use our military, we have to have a clear reason why we're doing that. We have to understand what the end goal is. And I also think that President Trump, for example, who's been especially careless threats of military force. If you'll remember, for example, early on in his term, he basically got into a Twitter fight with Kim Jong-un where he was threatening military force on Twitter, basically. And I think that's obviously the completely wrong approach. And also this huge display of this idea that the United States was going to wipe North Korea off the map, which essentially what the president threatening or implying. I don't think that that's very helpful. And I also think it undercuts our diplomatic effort at that point.
I should mention for our audience that we are taking questions. Please look at the Q&A tab under the viewer box and please offer any questions that you'd like. And maybe you can identify who you're with as well when you do that. On that theme that you were just talking about, I suppose we then should talk about China, because you mentioned North Korea, and China is considered a key factor in trying to contain North Korea, to try to curtail North Korea's missile and nuclear programs. And there's huge concern about China as a real threat to the U.S. There's this bipartisan consensus almost now, as you know, that China needs to be treated differently than in the past, that it's a serious adversary and competitor. Where does the U.S. draw the line with China, and where does it need cooperate? And is it possible to seek cooperation with China on something like North Korea or climate change, and at the same time confront China in a pretty aggressive way, whether it's on disinformation or intellectual property theft or access to their market?
Well, I think that, question, you've made a wonderful and important point, which is that we have this very ironic, oftentimes conflicting relationship with China, our largest trading partner. But China can be very helpful to us and the world in working on climate change, aiming in a way North Korea. And so to answer your question, I think it's imperative that we work with China on these issues. I think what the Congress has failed to do, and this administration has failed, is to draw an important distinction that will help guide our behavior. And that distinction is what it means for China to fairly compete versus what it means for China to cheat. And that important, I say exercise, but exercise seems kind of light compared to the importance of this. That's an important distinction that the new administration and the Congress, I think, has to fully think about. And I think that will ultimately guide our behavior with China. We don't want another Cold War with China. We want to be able to cooperate with them when it benefits. We, I think, want to be able to allow them to compete fairly, but also call them out when they cheat. So, for example, something that I have said and actually been asked about is that the Foreign Affairs Committee in this term has not had a full committee that is devoted exclusively with the full spotlight of the committee to what China is doing to the Uyghur Muslims in China. And that to me is a must for the legislative branch. We've got to go through these important paces diplomatically of putting pressure on China and working with our allies also to put pressure on China to change its behavior before we try to skip other steps and either threaten military force or anything else. And we haven't gone important paces yet in doing that. But again, I think we got to make a distinction between what it means to compete and what it means for them to cheat.
Does on the human rights issues, whether it's the Uyghurs or Hong Kong, should the U.S. link progress on human rights to trade disputes and other issues that the U.S. has with China? Should it go that
Yes,
far?
I think that we need to find a way to include it. Yes, I think that those issues are that important. I think that there is a new consciousness and a consciousness about who the United States engages with in the world. For example, in text, you've seen a lot of members of Congress reevaluate the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia. Yes, I think that it's fair game to say that we need to take these things into consideration. In the United States, in its foreign policy, in its posture, in the awareness of the American people, we evolve ourselves. We become more conscientious about these things. The public demands more from trade agreements. In many ways, we've had a lot of that the last several years. But you asked the question of human rights, and specifically with respect to China. Yeah, I think that should be part of it.
And then what about the military sort of strategic security aspect of the China threat, should we call it? Should the U.S. military be pushing back or asserting the right of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea, for that matter? And also, how do you square that need to perhaps counter China with also a progressive priority to rein in the defense budget, the Pentagon's budget, and to readjust U.S. military's role in the world? Isn't there a concern among some Asian allies that a Democratic presidency, a Biden presidency, might mean less assertive U.S. military presence in the Pacific?
Well, I think that we can both stand up for our allies, the freedom of navigation. As you know, China has gotten more aggressive over the years in the South China Sea, around the Senkaku Islands, has had issues with some of the ASEAN nations. I think that we can stand up for our allies and also be smarter, and I think actually spend less money than we have on certain parts of our military budget. And here's what I mean by that. And somebody who served now over 4 years on the Intelligence Committee, I believe that some of our military spending at this point is misplaced. And let me tell you what I mean by that. We are in a race right now on technology that, if other countries are more successful or are successful, can render the very expensive equipment that we buy, whether it's ships or fighter jets, equipment that costs hundreds of millions of dollars, some of it over $1 billion, can render some of that useless on the pounding of a few keystrokes. And so what I'm saying is that we spend more of our money actually figuring out those things like quantum computing and artificial intelligence, and so that are in many ways defensive actions for us and for our allies. At this point, simply buying more equipment rather than fixing or addressing those issues, next decade or even longer than that in particular, could prove to be a disastrous mistake for the United States. And so I actually think that that we could do it smarter, that we spend our money smarter than we do right now and still stand up for our allies.
What about, you mentioned technology. What about the idea of decoupling the U.S. economy, or at least decoupling certain sectors like the technology sector as much as possible from the Chinese economy? Is that a realistic and sensible policy proposal?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up. That's my line.
Just to say, on technology and China, do you support the idea of decoupling the tech sector or other economic sectors from the Chinese economy, the Chinese supply chain. You hear a lot of talk about decoupling. Do you support that idea? And is that a realistic policy goal?
I think that it's certainly something that we can examine, that we can take a look at. There certainly hasn't been a tremendous work yet that I've seen come to the Congress on it, but it's certainly something we can look at.
And then you talked about the State Department, and as you know, there's a lot of former diplomats who say that morale is very low in that department, and was not particularly high even before Trump took office. The budget has been pretty flat now for a while. How do you rebuild that department if it needs rebuilding? How do you make it a more diverse foreign service? Yes.
Okay.
And how do you make that workforce more diverse? Diversity has been a problem. And then I have another question. Do you favor the idea of just getting rid of political appointed ambassadors, especially campaign donors who get rewarded with ambassadorships? Other countries really don't do that. Is it time to end that?
That's a great question. And I apologize probably here because the walls of Congress, everything's so old and insulated and so forth. So it's breaking up a little bit, but let me try to answer. On the State Department, in terms of how we rebuild the State Department, there and how we make it worse, there are several initiatives underway. So I chair the subcommittee on oversight and investigation. We met with all of the affinity groups. That was the first meeting that we had. We've had 2 meetings on improving diversity now. A few years ago, I sponsored legislation or authored legislation that made it into a larger bill during the Obama years, preserve the Rangel Pickering Fellows to bring in a more diverse class of diplomats. The State Department has now recently, in the last few months, that it's expanding that program. So that's the entry. Karen Bass has a bill that passed out of the committee today, we just voted on creating a mid-level career entry path for people to come into the State Department. We're also doing work around retention because you see a lot of people, people heading for the door, need to figure out, and we're working on this, how do you keep people right? Now, I think, and again, this is editorializing, but I think that some of the exodus that we've seen over the last few years, because employees at the State Department have lost confidence in the Trump administration and don't want to be part of the Trump administration because it's so chaotic and because of the tone and because nobody can reasonably speak for the president because he goes off on tangents. But it's incumbent upon the Congress and the new president to work on all of these issues. And earlier this morning, we had a hearing on diversity in the intelligence community. It's a challenge there as well. So we're working on all of those issues and hopefully can make headway on that. But also, I believe we should do a new Foreign Service Act. There hasn't been a Foreign Service Act since 1980. It's been 40 years. We need to rebalance in Congress what I think leads to a preference for use of military force, or at least tends to draw through the military lens. And let me give you a specific example of what I mean. Every year in Congress, there's only a few bills that you'll hear members of Congress say are must-pass pieces of legislation. The budget, or the appropriations process, and the NDAA, which is one of them, the National Defense Authorization Act. But you never hear people state authorization or reauthorization act is a must-pass bill, or even an Intel Authorization Act. Now, the Intel Authorization Act has been passed fairly consistently, but what happens is of foreign affairs, because we don't often pass state reauthorization, any important piece of legislation, or many of them, will often get rolled into the NDAA. What that means is that you're taking a piece of foreign affairs legislation and running it through the armed services lens. And there is a cost to that in terms of the balancing of your military versus your diplomacy. And one real quick last example on this, because I do serve on the Intelligence Committee. I noticed when I came to the Intelligence Committee in 2016 that there were ex officio seats for the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense Operations. But there's no ex officio seat for the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So to me, that's an example of how the Congress, the legislative branch, is prioritizing, again, a military response and even military awareness or defense awareness of intelligence over the diplomatic response and a diplomat's awareness of intelligence. That leads, I think, in Congress to the imbalance that moves towards armed services.
Interesting. On military as maybe the default tool in U.S. foreign policy, often, I should ask you, as someone who's seen as a progressive, when should the U.S. use military force? And does that include circumstances where there is a civilian population facing potential genocide? And should the Pentagon's budget reflect the idea that the U.S. military must be superior to all its adversaries, the primacy of the U.S. military, to be able to fight two simultaneous wars and so on? A lot of these conventions that have backed up that spending. Do you buy into that as well?
Well, you asked the question, when should we use military force? Obviously, if our nation is under, we're also part of treaty alliances, for example, to help protect us. But remember, there's also different instances where you're going to use the military, and different, I guess, modes. So, for example, what you've seen the Trump administration is go it alone, oftentimes, right? Rather than engage our allies and set around the responsibility for addressing military situations around the world. I think we have to be mindful and very cautious about the United States going it alone on these military challenges. And we have to work with our allies. And again, generally, as a philosophy, we have about how we're not just going to kick ass, right? In terms of humanitarian situations, look, I think there's times over the years where we have seen genocidal actions where I think military action was appropriate, right? Where we've seen populations that were extremely oppressed, where military action was appropriate. But I also think that that's a determination. That's a situation, again, where Congress has to be part of that decision, and we spectators to that decision, right? You need more voices. You need more heads coming together as part of the United States government, rather than just the president or the executive branch or a small team of militaries who are making that decision. And so that's why I'm saying that Congress has to reassert constitutional authority in these matters.
What about on that issue with this drone strikes, that these killings that are targeting suspected or alleged terrorists? That was carried out very aggressively under the Obama administration as well. And there are voices who have criticized that, saying this is essentially circumventing Congress, that it's basically U.S. military action that is not really getting any treatment in the check and balance system. Do you think that has to end, that when the U.S. goes and targets a suspected terrorist or an adversary with a lethal drone strike, that just can't be done without some kind of congressional authorization?
I think so. I think we need to move closer to that. Again, I can't discuss all of it because it is classified and I'm on the Intelligence Committee. But I do think, looking back over the last 4 years, I'll say this: there are times where I think that it has been done too freely, and Congress should have a stronger role in those determinations.
And then maybe this is also related to that, and I'm looking at a question that someone's offered up, and I remind everyone to ask a question if you'd like online. Just look at the Q&A tab under the viewer box. This is a question that I had as well, which is, you talked about the need to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan. should that be based on certain conditions, including whether the Taliban commit to some kind of a democratic system involving elections and rights for women and so on and so forth?
Yeah, and if you look at what Ilhan tried to do, I mean, she was trying to accomplish certain things in that legislation. I would call it a responsible exit. It wasn't just okay, we're right away. It was a responsible exit. So yes, we would still have goals that we're trying to accomplish. But as you know, there was a peace process, and we were aiming to get to those goals. Part of the challenge with that, with the Trump administration, again, is that they tend to be a little bit cavalier, and it wasn't inclusive of all of the different. So I think that we can actually get there.
And then we have a little bit of breaking news since last night that I wanted to ask you. The administration announced its decision on the ceiling for refugee admissions for the next fiscal year. And the number is 15,000, which is a historic low, as you know, even lower than the last ceiling, which was 18,000. I am assuming you're not going to be a fan of this decision. What is happening on that issue? And do you think that it reflects the will of the American people? Has the Democratic Party or have human rights groups failed to explain why more refugees should be admitted into the country?
Well, first, I'm a big opponent of the decisions that the administration made with respect to refugees, not just this decision, but even going back a few years now. Look, the goal of Stephen Miller and President Trump, folks at the White House, is to keep people out, particularly to keep brown people out. Let's consider for a second where we are, the United States as a nation, with respect to the world right now. The United States, I believe, is as closed off as it's ever been in modern American history right now during this pandemic than we've been in the modern era. Let me tell you why I say that. Because many visas you can't get now to come to the United States. Because unless it's changed recently, green cards were frozen. Naturalization ceremonies for a few months at least were frozen. So even people who all they had to do was ceremony and take an oath couldn't do it. Now, despite the backlog, these ceremonies are operating only at asylum seekers to this nation are being summarily expelled without any kind of due process. And so you think about how this president using the pandemic as an excuse. Now, I think many Americans, if you did that, temporarily, you said, we're going to take 4 weeks or so, or some period, we need to figure out what's going on with this virus. I think, people would say, okay, it's now been 6 months or more, actually, and there's no intention by this president, it seems like, to change it. And in fact, I would argue if President Trump is reelected, it's only going to get worse. And these new restrictions that have been placed on people are being made permanent, some of them. And so look, I think all of us can do a better job of communicating with our fellow Americans why being a place to seek refuge is important and has been important throughout the generations. And remember, generations, people coming from Europe, from Latin America, from other places around the world, the reason they were coming to the United States was for some kind of refuge. And that need continues today. There are 80 million people right now in the world who are displaced from their homes. And so we need to get back to a place where refugee cap, Zoe Lofgren, for example, with the GRACE Act, proposes moving that cap up to 95,000. During the Obama years, I believe at one point it was 100,000. So I'm an advocate for getting this back. I've had many conversations with Catholic Relief Services, for example, and that's the irony, is that it's actually some of the more conservative groups and religious organizations that help settle refugees to the United States. Got to get that number back up. we've got to, again, be a place of refuge for the oppressed and vulnerable people.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question from a member of our online audience. Mark Hand is asking, in this week's presidential debate, he put that in quotes, debate, Biden mentioned Russia's placing bounties on U.S. soldiers' heads. What range of options would you suggest that a possible future President Biden consider in response to that? And do you think that there would be pressure to show strength right in the early days of his administration if he's elected?
That's a great question, and it's a realistic question that the new administration is going to have to confront. But let's start from a very basic level and then go from there. The first thing Vice President Biden in January can do is say something about it. President Trump has hardly uttered a word about it. It doesn't seem like it's affected his relationship, his dealings with Vladimir Putin at all. First thing the president can do and should do is actually stand up to Vladimir Putin and let him know very strongly and very sternly that the United States is not going to accept that. It's a basic thing, and it is, but consider the fact that the current president has not even done that. In foreign affairs, actually, one of the other folks that's running for chair of foreign affairs, Greg Meeks, had a bill that allow Russia from joining the G7, right? And so we're going to have to go through first, I think, different paces of diplomatic options about how we confront Russia. But look, it also speaks to, in terms of military awareness of the threats, we'll have to be aware the military has to be as prepared as possible. The Biden administration has to work with the military on making sure the military is prepared as possible to protect our service members. So we need to consider these diplomatic options. By the way, with respect to Russia, have to get a lot better at cybersecurity. I don't believe that we spent enough time buffeting our different systems, our critical infrastructure, and not only doing it ourselves, working with allies to help each other do the same thing. I've spoken about the need for a cyber NATO. I know that NATO has a cyber component, but I also think that it's underdeveloped, that considering the threats to our critical infrastructure, the threats of election, not the threat, the reality interference, that we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of our capabilities and our cyber alliances around the world.
I'm going to give you another question. You talked about Congress's role in authorizing military force and that needs to be restored. And you talked about an AUMF. If there was a new authorization for military force adopted in Congress, what would it look like? And what do you think the factors should be in that? And how would it look different than the one that was written?
Sure. Well, another great question. And let me start with this, and then I'll to what was asked. The Congress, the executive branch over the years, under different presidents, has, I think, tried to take powers from Congress in terms of declarations of use of military force. But there are also points in which I think the Congress has willfully acquiesced those to the executive branch. And I want to take you back to the summer of 2013, August specifically. The Syrian War, of course, came to the American consciousness in a big, and you remember the discussion over the red line and so forth. And there was a moment there where the Obama administration was trying to decide, okay, what is our response? And is it going to be a military response? If so, what is that military response going to look like? And I remember getting, I think, about 1,300 emails, outreach, basically, within the span of about a week and a half, many of them from my district, folks from my district, San Antonio, which is known as Military City, USA. And most of those folks saying, don't do it. Don't get us committed to another war, anywhere in that region, right? Including the family members of service members who were reaching out in San Antonio. And so what the administration, the White House, figured out, look, this is me kind of estimating their minds. This is obviously a very controversial situation. If we're going to even consider, for example, putting on the ground, whatever we're going to do, we need Congress to be a partner in this and buy in. So the White House, as you recall, a draft AUMF to the Congress. And what happened to that draft AUMF? Nothing happened to the draft AUMF. Congress decided to willfully stay on the sidelines. And I don't mean that, hey, we should have put boots on the ground. What I'm saying is that you got to decide that Congress has to play an active role. If you say, we're not giving you any permission to do much of anything, right? If that's the position, or if we're going to give the executive branch authority to do a lot of things, right? Whatever it is, we need to be able to an active role and not just be spectators. Now to the issue of, well, what does that look like, right? But that's the process that we have to go through in the Congress. That's the process that the legislative branch needs to engage in, the Affairs Committee needs to engage in. The issue of when you can use military force, is it only when the United States or its allies are threatened? Is it in humanitarian situations? Is it just for terrorism now? And also where you can use that military force, all right? The 2001 AUMF that has been used to combat terrorism in different parts of the world was fairly broad and has been used in a very broad and vast way, I would argue. So how exactly do you rein that in? Do you rein it in geographically and contain it to a certain area? Or do you rein it in by function? And those are all things that we have to go through and make a decision on as a Congress.
Thank you. We have to end it there. I had more questions, but have to wait for another time. Thanks for your time, Congressman Castro, and thanks for the audience questions. And I will turn it over to the Truman Center. Thank you again.
Around the world, election ecosystems are in constant motion, shifting under the forces of countless influences, including the viral messages spread through social media. Social media platforms are only as accurate and truthful as the people who post to them. The level and quality of fact-checking varies from one platform to the next. That means that half-truths or flat-out fiction may appear as facts. People who are predisposed to believe the postings will perceive them as the truth. When deception and misinformation impact the infrastructure, operations, and processes integral to our democracy, our elections, we must call it out and correct it. MITRE Squint provides a fast, easy, and comprehensive way for election officials to combat the spread of misinformation on social media channels. When elections officials and designated MITRE Squint users see untrue or inaccurate postings about the elections process, you can report it with a single click, whether using a desktop or mobile device. MITRE Squint collects a screenshot and the coded information for aggregation and analysis. You'll get a secure message to verify that you sent the screenshot. The verification message includes a report that you can share with election peers or send to the social media channel asking that the misinformation be removed. What happens then? MITRE Squint analyzes and identifies patterns in social media that are misleading voters. Your report enables faster takedowns and helps restore integrity to the elections process. MITRE Squint is helping election officials like you defend the elections process from disinformation campaigns designed to undermine election legitimacy. Contact us to learn more about MITRE Squint and become a participant. squint@mitre.org.
Hello, Trumanites. Greetings from rich, diverse, and sunny Los Angeles. My name is Eliane Farsan. I'm a first-generation Arab American, and I'm here to talk to you about the immigration crisis. Today, roughly 258 million people are international migrants around the world. That's 3.4% out of the 7.7 billion world population. 70.8 million of those migrants were forcibly displaced by war, violence, and climate change. Only a fraction of those, less than 30 million, are refugees. That's 0.38% of the world population. Yes, you heard it right. 0.38% of the global population is considered by xenophobes and, quite frankly, lightweights, a crisis. Let me be clear. What we are experiencing today is a crisis of morals, a crisis of consciousness, not a crisis of numbers, and certainly not a crisis that we don't have the means to solve. My fellow Trumanites, the next panel will talk about the pandemic as a pretext to end immigration. Indeed, more than 205,000 Americans have died of COVID-19, and President Trump's answers to questions about his administration's inadequate response center on closing the borders, as opposed to how his administration should have medically responded to this public health crisis. This xenophobic reaction is nothing new in the history of pandemics filled with outbursts of fear-mongering and anti-immigration hysteria. In the US, we've always used race as an organizing principle to define problems in the economy, in the culture, and problems in the political domain. When there's a pandemic or any kind of health crisis, our existing ideas about race naturally shape how we process and frame the situation. Let's take a moment to think about how immigration and race intersect with the coronavirus. When our ideas about race define who is safe, or who is contaminated, or who is most likely to carry or spread the disease, or which borders we should close, we allow a scapegoating, xenophobic administration to carry out its long-planned anti-immigrant agenda without much pushback. What is surprising is that in the 21st century, even when we have a better understanding of diseases and how to combat them, our reactions are still not based on science, but rather on our perceptions, which are still distorted by our biases. The more these racial biases influence our response to a threat like a virus, the worse the health outcomes for everyone. 205,000 COVID-19 deaths is an evident outcome of our racism, and it's time to do something about it. So no, we don't have an immigration problem in the United States. We have xenophobia and racism, and it's time to call things what they are. Only when we start looking at immigrants as part of our American social fabric can we look at immigration as a civil rights issue and make it part of our essential reform agenda. Let's lead with that, Trumanites.
Good afternoon and good morning. I'm Adam Hunter. I'm an Executive Director of Refugee Council USA and a proud Truman Fellow since 2008. I'll be moderating and guiding us through this next discussion. First off, I want to provide some thanks to Jenna Ben-Yehuda, Julia Burnell, and the entire team at Truman for making this conversation possible on such an important occasion at such consequential time. We have a really big task before us for this discussion on immigration and the pandemic. Some of the Trump administration's most expansive uses of executive power, in fact, have been in the immigration space. 4 years in, there's virtually no part of the immigration system left untouched by this action. Then came a global pandemic. Most countries enacted reasonable temporary border security measures and travel restrictions. But here in the US, the Trump administration did far more than just that. They've erected a parallel immigration restriction architecture that is poised to outlast the pandemic emergency. And because the challenges with the pandemic are ongoing, we haven't yet seen the full effect of all these changes of just the past few months. But they do have the potential to reshape not only our immigration system, but our entire country. and none of this was done with any act of Congress. To bring important perspective to this moment, I'm thrilled to be joined by three very distinguished colleagues and friends. First, I'd like to introduce now Karen Tumlin from Los Angeles, who is the founder of the Justice Action Center, an organization that combines impact litigation and storytelling. She's a nationally recognized litigator of immigration rights and has been part of the legal team that has brought several Supreme Court cases, including the recent DACA case before the Supreme Court. Previously, she was the legal director of the National Immigration Law Center, also in Los Angeles. Next, I'd like to welcome Ali Nurani, President and CEO of the National Immigration Forum here in Washington, D.C. The forum's a nonpartisan advocacy organization working with faith, law enforcement, and business leaders. He's a California native and son of Pakistani immigrants, a very frequent and thoughtful commentator on a range of immigration issues, and the host of a podcast I'd recommend, Only in America. Finally, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Marvin Yorasha, who's the president and CEO of Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Service, an organization that's been welcoming refugees for the past 8 years. Her own family escaped civil war, and she arrived to Maryland as a baby. In a prior iteration, she had practiced law, also worked in the private sector, and served several years in the Obama administration, first at the Department of State as a senior advisor to the Secretary of State, and then at the White House, where she was the policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama. Thank you all for joining us and for having this important panel. To give us a little sense of how we'll cover this discussion, I'm going to start with asking each of our panelists a broad introductory question so that we can really lay the important issues we want to unpack on the table. We're going to have then a bit of a moderated discussion amongst ourselves on the panel, and then we'll open the last 20 to 25 minutes to audience Q&A. You can see and start to submit your questions via the viewer, which is below the window. You should be able to find that on your screen. So to start, I'd like to ask Karen, with your legal and policy expertise, could you paint for us an illustration of both the breadth and the depth of the Trump administration's changes on immigration policies? And if you would also describe the rush of changes that we've seen just in the past couple of months with the pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam. It is a pleasure to be with all of you and to be on this important panel. I'm going to basically try to talk about the Trump administration immigration changes in 5 main categories. The last is what Adam just alluded to, which is how these changes went on warp speed when the pandemic came into force. But, really stepping back, I want to say that President Trump, of course, in his original run for president, campaigned on immigration. It was one of his flagship issues, and we saw massive changes to the immigration system starting on his 4th day in office. And those changes have kept on coming. So big picture, we're literally at over 100 presidential actions to change the immigration system of all sorts. But let's kind of rewind quickly to the major 5 categories. So first, most people remember day 4 in office, the president makes good on his promise to enact a Muslim ban. Absolutely breathtaking change, unprecedented in historical scope, and that was in fact his first major policy move. So what I have seen from the president's changes in his 4 years now in office is first, what I would categorize as presidential changes to immigration policy that create a larger class of undocumented immigrants. So here I'm talking about things like essentially taking away temporary status from individuals or attempting to and rendering them undocumented. The 2 biggest examples of this are obviously the attempt by the president to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, that would have, if it had been allowed to take full effect, render 800,000 young people undocumented again. So that's one example. The second example is the presidential efforts to end temporary protected status for folks. So temporary protected status is something that's given on a country basis to individuals who are in the country undocumented, but because of either civil strife in their country, so think protracted civil war, or humanitarian disasters. We have given them temporary protection here. Again, just a couple weeks ago, we had a decision that would allow those large-scale removal of temporary protected status for many nationalities to take place over the next year if President Trump is reelected. So that's really category one. But that really deals with individuals who are already in the country and taking away a temporary protection and rendering them undocumented. Category two, I would say, deals with limiting the inflow of immigrants to the United States. And here I think it's really important to talk about two different categories. One, and I know that my colleague Chris will be talking about this later, is humanitarian immigration, right? So our refugee system, which has, and I'm really pleased that we're having this important discussion today on October 1st, which is the deadline for submitting our refugee numbers for the year. But President Trump has radically gutted our refugee system as we know it. It's a system where we've had, under President Obama, who was increasing these numbers to really take on our global share. We're seeing the lowest historical ever numbers for refugees that would come in. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because I am flanked by just absolute refugee experts, and I know you'll get to hear from them. But I do want to mark that as a change in what we do for our overall immigration system, right? A radical restriction of the United States' role in welcoming refugees. Secondly, and this is a piece that we have seen absolutely put on steroids once COVID hit, President Trump has made clear that he wants to radically reform the legal immigration system to the United States. He tried and failed to get his changes through Congress. We have, as most of you know, a legal immigration system to issue green cards really in three primary categories, right? Family-based immigration, employment-based immigration, and then humanitarian immigration, which includes refugees and other things. President Trump wants to replace that with a merit-based system that really would radically reduce our family-based system. Again, this is congressionally mandated. These weren't made up willy-nilly. And his proposal to change that through Congress didn't happen. What we have seen after COVID is that the president has introduced the most sweeping immigration ban possible on family-based immigrants, diversity visa immigrants, and employment immigrants as well. And again, I would like to put my cards on the table. This is a lawsuit that my organizations and others have brought. The reason is we're talking about in 1 year alone that the president's immigration ban would block over 500,000 immigrants from coming in. And I want to give you just a couple of brief examples. First, family-based immigrants. So some of them, thankfully, are exempt from the president's order. But because of COVID, the president said, absolutely no parents of U.S. citizens may come into the country. Now, the rationale for this change is, and it's a worthy rationale to consider, economic recovery. But by and large, parents of U.S. citizens are not necessarily coming in to enter the labor market. They're often coming in to, for example, care for children of U.S. citizens, so that they, as oftentimes essential workers and others, may be able to go back into the labor market fully in the times we're dealing with. Okay, so moving on. Category 3. President Trump has eliminated any type of prioritization on who we deport. And so the reason I want to really highlight this is this also changes the composition of who's in the country. So it's a ramping up of our deportation machinery Under President Obama, there was a move that increased over his tenure in office to ensure that deportations were tied primarily to criminal convictions. That's something that was removed by this president, meaning that individuals who have been here for a long time, US citizen children, no criminal records, are now being deported in rapid numbers. That is changing the composition of our immigrant population in the US. The last change that I want to talk about before speaking briefly on COVID is the border. And here I really do mean, and I am the daughter of a Canadian immigrant, I'm talking about the US southern border, not the US northern border. So the president has, over the last several years, including before COVID, really radically changed our policies at the US-Mexico border with respect to asylum seekers. And I think most of you are familiar with this. The biggest change is a series of policy changes that prohibit asylum seekers from entering the country and seeking asylum. This has resulted in really dire conditions along the US-Mexico border, where we have camps of migrants who are being held, in tent cities essentially for many, many months as they await the ability to come in and present their asylum claim before an extremely limited immigration court tribunal. They are, and this is not an exaggeration by any means, there's incredible documentation done by our friends at Human Rights Watch. These migrants, unfortunately, are very much sitting ducks for rape, assault, abuse, violence, and death while they're awaiting proceedings. I always lead with that, but also being in this situation makes it nearly impossible for them to find legal representation. The sum result is that the asylum ability to seek asylum, even with a meritorious claim, has been radically reduced. And the last thing I want to talk about before turning it back to Adam is COVID. What has happened under COVID for immigration policy? Now, I want to be clear, all of our lives are touched by COVID, and there are sensible policies, screening at the border, temperature checks, quarantine even, that I and others would support. It is not what the president has done. He has instead used the pandemic as an excuse to do things like I discussed earlier, enacting a ban on immigration for over 500,000 individuals, not tied to a concern that they will spread the pandemic, but tied to his own ideological definition of who he thinks should belong and come in, and trying to eliminate the diversity visa program, which is something he's wanted to do for years and cannot get through Congress, and trying to eliminate certain categories of family-based immigrants. And so that's my issue with the COVID policies. If you have a COVID policy because it is going to keep us safer and help with containment of the pandemic, I am open-minded. If you have a policy where you're going to use a pandemic as an excuse to seek ideological changes to the immigration system, I'm not down with that. Adam, that's what I'd say by way of summary, and turn it back to you.
I'm not down with that. Message heard. Thank you, Karen, for painting that very broad overview. Ali, I wanted to turn to you. So much change in the immigration space, so many obvious impacts to immigrants, but also Americans. I'd love to hear you talk about what you think has shifted in the broader populace. And if you could weigh in a little bit too on what the impact might be if these changes Karen's talking about take place on our economy and even our society going forward.
Great. Well, I mean, first of all, I really want to the Truman Project. I want to thank Adam for pulling together this panel, and I really want to thank my colleagues on the panel, Krish and Karen. Both of them are running and leading two of the most important organizations in the country, both in terms of the litigation fight that goes on and on and on and on, but also the resettlement of refugees and the advocacy for immigrants and refugees that LIRS does across the country. So just wanted to start with a thank you. So Adam, I would say that it's a bit of a mixed bag, because on one hand, I think the public has come to really greatly appreciate the contributions of immigrants. But on the other hand, there have been questions that are raised about the future of immigration. And there's a couple of different ways that are kind of parsing out concerns. But I think it's important that as we're moving into the future that we be very clear-eyed about the challenges that we face. So first of all, in terms of the current workforce in the United States, so roughly speaking, I think about 16% of the workforce writ large is foreign-born. But let's look at occupations vital to the COVID-19 response, and what is the percentage of foreign-born workers in some of those occupations. So, graders and sorters of agricultural products. Over 60% of workers in that particular occupation are foreign-born. Packers and packagers who are doing things in essence with their hands. Almost 50% of that occupation is staffed by the foreign-born. Ag workers, just miscellaneous, again, almost 50%. Food processing workers, nearly 40%. Home health aides, nearly 40%. Physicians, nearly 30%. Get down to pharmacists. Almost 25% of pharmacists are foreign-born. Nursing assistants, also again, almost 25%. So in these occupations that are vital to the nation's response and recovery to COVID-19, the data makes it very clear that immigrants are playing a disproportionate role in helping the country move forward. Now, the promising thing is that the public is seeing that, and the American public is realizing that without the contributions of immigrants in these vital occupations, we would be in an even worse position than we are now. So, I'll just run through a few numbers from recent polls. In April of this year, there's an Ipsos poll that found that 40% agreed that the government should provide aid to undocumented immigrants who could not work due to layoffs and illness. 40% disagreed. But then a month later, the Pew Research Center released results which found that more than 2/3 of respondents said they thought that the government should provide health care for undocumented immigrants who contracted COVID-19. Those are two very good numbers in terms of the public understanding what the contributions, but also the challenges that are being faced by the immigrant community. On the other hand, this same poll by Ipsos in April 2020, 79% of respondents agreed that immigration from all of the countries should be temporarily stopped. And Karen got to this a little bit in terms of, yes, we do need to have practical measures in place to protect the health of the country. My concern is that when does a temporary pause become in the worst case scenario, a permanent pause, or even a continued contraction of legal immigration into the future? Let me fast forward to another Ipsos poll that was released in August, so a little more recent. In this poll, respondents said that they, again, supported a temporary closing of the border at the 78% level. They agreed that it was reasonable to prevent legal immigrants from bringing extended family members to the U.S. at a level of 60%. 58% of respondents believe that we should be banning the entry of guest workers and seasonal workers. And 58% believe that we should be banning the entry of asylum seekers and refugees. Those are really challenging numbers, and that begins to give us a sense of kind of what is the challenge moving forward. At the same time, in this poll, half of respondents said that they supported the federal government sending stimulus checks to undocumented immigrants who pay taxes. So that number is actually starting to inch up. So there is this, and for those of us who have kind of been in the immigration space for a long time, we're used to this kind of cognitive dissonance within the public's understanding of the value of immigrants and immigration. But within that dissonance, there is an opportunity. Because I do think, like I said at the beginning, people have come to understand what the contribution of immigrants are today. Again, whether it's the agricultural, the food system, healthcare system, services overall, I think people have really internalized what those contributions are. But going back to what Karen was saying, we've seen over the last 4 years a continued effort to contract or decrease the number of legal immigrants to the United States, whether it's for work visas or family, or just like we saw late last night around the refugee resettlement ceiling for this coming fiscal year. So my fear here is that in the public's mind, they are beginning to internalize this idea that maybe the country doesn't need a flow, a sustainable and a stable flow of legal immigrants. But you start to kind of take a step back and you realize very quickly that if we as a nation continue on this trajectory to limit legal immigration, we're going to be paying an economic and a social cost that'll be quite expensive in the years and the generations ahead. We did some research back in 2015 that found, when we did it with the American Action Forum, which is a conservative think tank here in DC, and that by just after 20, the private sector would see a worker shortage of over 7 million. So, that number may have changed because of COVID-19, but the dynamics are by and large remaining the same. We're going to be coming out with a paper later this fall that's going to be looking actually at the demographic change of the country and looking at the legal immigration needs of the United States vis-a-vis the aging of our population. And, to kind of give you a bit of a spoiler alert, we're going to be making the case that as the United States continues to age, and the workforce across occupations continues to decrease, we're actually going to need to start to incrementally increase legal immigration to the U.S. So my point here is that, whether it's from an economic perspective, a social perspective, or even from a national security perspective, we need to be thinking about the value of immigrants and immigration as a benefit to the United States in terms of creation of jobs, provision of services, from a law enforcement perspective in terms of serving and protecting, whether it's in a community like Salt Lake City, or serving and protecting the United States in a nation such as Afghanistan as a member of our armed services. In many states and localities, in fact, a legal permanent resident can join the Army and defend the United States overseas, but cannot come back to their community and serve and protect their community as a local police officer. And then finally, from a cultural perspective, and we do a lot of work in the faith community, the opportunity way that the country is changing in terms of rural areas and suburban areas, all of those changes are taking place in schools, in churches, in community organizations, where communities are really starting to get to know each other, and kind of irrespective of our very kind of divisive national politics, it's in these organizations at a local level where the friendships and the relationships are being generated that we hope that over time will change the political tenor of the nation's immigration debate. So to end where I started, I think there's a lot of positive things to see in terms of how the public is understanding the contribution of immigrants. We have to be very clear-eyed about the challenges that we face in the future.
Thank you, Ali, and I appreciate your sketching there a lot of the ranges of domestic impact and opportunity that immigration brings, and the impact, frankly, the risk of policies under the Trump administration have to perpetuate some challenges there. Krish, I wanted to add here yet another layer to the discussion, and that is looking outward and also making the connection to our national security. And we all woke up this morning at the beginning of the new federal fiscal year to the news that the administration is going to propose a new low of resettled refugees at just 15,000, far, far below the average 95,000 goal that has been since the beginning of the program 40 years ago. In addition, earlier this week, we had a quote from a former Trump administration Homeland Security Counterterrorism Assistant Secretary who was quoted as saying the reduction is really not based on security, but driven by impetus to keep people out. From your positions at LIRS and also State Department in particular, I mean, how does these moves and all of the policy changes we've heard, how do these impact the U.S.'s ability to lead globally, and how do you see the impact to our national security?
Thanks, Adam, for the question. Thanks for hosting this event, and really wonderful to be here with amazing colleagues who are helping fight the good fight in what has felt for a few years now like this war on immigration and immigrants. So just to contextualize it, and as Karen and Ali have eloquently laid out, we really are at an abysmally low point when it comes to immigration. The massive, seemingly endless policy changes are more than a nightmare for immigrants and their families. And for our economies and communities, what they are is an abdication of global leadership, and truly an active threat to our national security. And so it's really appreciated the opportunity to talk about this issue in that context. Security and refugees is obviously a hot topic. All you have to do is turn on the news and you hear those two terms put together. There's a pervasive, destructive myth out there that immigrants pose a threat to national security. Anti-immigration pundits posit that criminals are trying to slip through our borders, that immigrants commit crimes, that they're drug dealers, rapists, and it's not just pundits. It's also our current president. So some of you may recall that Trump's comments at a recent rally describing Somali Americans as radical Islamic terrorists. It's absurd. It's offensive, and let's call it what it is. It's a lie. As we well know at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service through our work, refugees and immigrants go through an intense vetting process. Background checks, Karen alluded to this as well, security checks, fingerprinting, health screening, in-person interviews with DHS. It's incredibly rigorous. And it's been proven time and time again that natural-born citizens commit crimes at much higher rates than immigrants. In fact, higher rates of immigration are actually associated with lower overall crime rates. Immigrants, in fact, contribute exponentially to our economy and our society, making America safer. And so restricting immigration does not, particularly when it comes to issues of foreign policy and national security, aid America, in this claim of self-interest. Beyond that, of course, immigration, it's an ethical and moral imperative, but it's also a vital tool for diplomacy. Our global refugee crisis today, it's unprecedented. At this moment, there are more than 69 million people displaced from their homes, forced to flee due to war and persecution. And this administration's announcement, just released last night, and so appreciate this timely conversation, is proposing to lower our refugee ceiling to just 15,000 for the fiscal year 2021, the lowest in the history of the U.S. refugee admissions program. Last year, the ceiling was just 18,000, and we didn't even meet that. We're settling only 11,814 refugees. All this while constant policy changes, essentially aim to end asylum at our southern border. And so we are in effect showing that the United States is no longer a humanitarian leader and that we don't care about anyone beyond our borders. And so the question is, what kind of example does that set? If we are demonstrating total disregard for the most vulnerable worldwide, why would any other countries trust us? Other countries are bearing the brunt of global displacement. We're not even in the top 10. We've abdicated that leadership and complicated our domestic and our diplomatic relationships. We no longer set the model for humanitarian action on the global stage, which has a disastrous domino effect in decreasing humanitarian action. And that's not to mention the effect of essential decimation of immigration that has in the eyes of our allies. I can't imagine, what we look like to Turkey, which has been embroiled in active conflict for decades, and yet it still harbors the most refugees of any country in the world. But the disintegration of immigration in the United States is not just damaging for our international reputation and relationships. We know that immigrants make our economy stronger and our society more culturally rich, but we also have to think about the U.S.'s reputation and the toll it's taking in terms of would-be new Americans, because our new visa restrictions are affecting our ability to attract and recruit international talent. And even if these restrictions were not in place, the US has anything but a pristine reputation for its treatment of foreign-born students and workers. And so limiting immigration directly limits innovation, and we're bound to suffer for it. The Niskanen Center put it succinctly in a 2018 article on this very topic, where they said, officials and experts have explained that resettling refugees advances U.S. strategic interests in 4 major areas. It aids in the recruitment of intelligence assets abroad, increases U.S. global influence, undermines anti-Western propaganda, and helps promote stability in foreign countries. Writer Matthew Iglesias actually offers another interesting perspective in his new book titled 1 Billion Americans. He suggests that the United States can't afford to decrease immigration because more citizens equals more power on the international stage. Now, I know that may sound like I'm commodifying this issue, but there is a part of his argument that rings true, because we need immigrants and their contributions to keep our country strong. And, I'll try to summarize, my final point, which is that this applies to our military too. So under these constant immigration policy changes, our national security takes a direct, concrete hit, because immigrants account for a significant portion of our military strength. There are 2.4 million veterans of immigrant origin, either because they themselves are immigrants or they are the children of immigrants. And that accounts for 13% of all veterans. And they continue to serve. About 8,000 non-citizen immigrants enlist in our military each year. And so in a 2006 hearing on the contributions of immigrants to the military, Senator John McCain pointed out that, immigrants actually represent a critical part of our national security. And so, this is where I think it's really important for us to understand the implications of what the administration has done. Because, when we have these kinds of issues, what McCain said, what I think is a really salient point. He said, if we do not provide the same opportunities for future immigrants that we provided for our forefathers, it is an affront to our national ideals. We owe these servicemen more for the sacrifices they have made for this country. And so, our service to our nation no longer offers a guarantee of naturalization. In 2019, naturalization rates fell a staggering 43% from the previous year. That is also applied to special immigrant visas. For those of you who may not know, SIVs, these are issued to Iraqi and Afghan nationals who assisted the U.S. military and put their lives in risk. So in FY20, the U.S. had the opportunity to welcome 13,000 SIVs. We only welcomed 9,630. It's not bad, but it's just not where we need to be. So I'll end with the words of General Mattis, who in 2019 wrote a memo advocating against further cuts. And he said, the failure to honor our commitment to those who have supported the U.S. would undermine our diplomatic and military efforts by making it more difficult to sustain the support of partners elsewhere. So let me just end with this question. If the United States cannot support those who have given us so much socially, economically, culturally, and for some risking their lives and the health and safety of themselves and their families, how can we expect anyone to support the U.S. from a national security perspective?
Thank you very much for the powerful set of comments, Krish, there. Ali, I wanted to go back to you to pick up, I think, on this question of impact and security and identity and who we are aspiring to be as Americans. You've had some recent writings, some very compelling writings where you're using the themes of pandemics have villains and the need for heroes and crossing and seeking to cross a threshold. I'd be curious if you could unpack a little bit what you're meaning and thinking about in terms of these, using these terms in the present context.
Okay. So a lot of what I've been thinking, so there's a new book out called A Mighty and Irresistible Tide, and it's written by Jia Lin Yang. And, it is easily, from my perspective, kind of one of the best immigration books out there, because she looks at this period of time between the 1920s and 1965. But she doesn't get into the policy details and all of kind of the legalese. What she does is looks at kind of the key players over time, and then the context, the political context within which those players operated. And when you look at American history between the 1920s and 1965, you have, the establishment of, racial quotas in the immigration system. You have, the United States saying to Jewish refugees fleeing Nazis, no, you can't come in. You have moments where the country is moving aggressively in the direction of eugenics. You see, the civil rights movement emerge and just finally get to the Civil Rights Acts of 1965. But in these 50 years, so many very scary things happen, but also so many kind of inspirational things happen. So what I've been trying to think about is, who are the heroes of today that help us kind of get past the threshold that we face now? Because, a lot of people these days will say, well, things are terrible. A friend of mine wrote, we've crossed a threshold and, our best days are behind us. Well, I cannot believe that, the United States' best days were the days when we were having an active debate about eugenics and racism. I have to believe that our best days are still in front of us. So my point here is that, and we see this quite a bit in our organizing work, conservatives and moderates, and, again, across faith, law enforcement, businesses, how do you, tap into someone's aspirational identity? How do you have a conversation, whether it's directly or through a broader communication strategy, that helps someone who has questions and concerns about immigration, but help them, kind of get closer to who they aspire to be, whether it's as a conservative person of faith, a law and order voter, someone who believes in the free market. And I think that so much of our problem right now kind of is that we've been dragged into this very deeply polarized debate, and we don't give ourselves the time and the opportunity to think about what do other people who have questions and concern about immigration, what do they aspire to be what do they aspire in terms of the country for their kids? And I think if we were to approach our advocacy that way and approach our communications that way, we could over time really begin to expand the coalition and ensure that really our best days as a country are ahead of us.
Thank you for sharing that. Krish, I wanted to come back to you and picking up actually an audience question here on specifically the refugee cap, and recognizing that it's Vice President Biden has proposed a cap of 125, and wanting to see how the partners could be ready to deliver on that. And I think, adding to that, Ali's observations, what is the social impact on growing this program? And how do we think differently about meeting that need where people are in the communities where they live?
Yeah, so I say the last several years have been a roller coaster ride when you think about the refugee resettlement space in particular. But it'll be interesting to see kind of where we can go and how we get there, if in fact we, have a change in administration. Part of what we have noticed in the last year is there was an unintended consequence of the president's executive order that he issued last year. So the president published an executive order requiring governors and local leaders to explicitly declare a willingness to accept refugees. And what's interesting is that we actually had 42 governors from Republican and Democratic states explicitly publish this affirmation. We had over 109, local leaders. And I think that speaks to the fact that when you actually take this out of partisan politics and, many of these communities came together and debated, you actually had a current, popular declaration that refugee resettlement, whether it's a matter of faith, whether it's a matter of economic interest, whether it's a matter of who America has, been as a nation, the communities have recognized the value. So the question is, if we actually do have a presidential determination of 125,000, we can actually harness this community support because we have programs called community co-sponsorship, where refugee resettlement agencies like mine work with the community to actually support a refugee family that is located in their community. And so, I can't say because there are a number of systems issues that have developed over the last few years because of what has felt like death by 1,000 cuts, that we'll get to 125,000 in the first year of a new administration, because we're going to need to build the pipeline abroad, but also build the capacity here at home. But I can tell you that we're going to get to at least triple, quadruple where we are now, because the capacity, the willingness, the enthusiasm is definitely there in the field.
Thank you, Christian. I think like you and Ali, I've been inspired by the conversations I've seen happen and the receptivity of Americans all around the country to be engaged and involved in immigration issues, in refugee resettlement. And Karen, I want to come to you on this because there's something that still striking about the manner in which this administration has approached these issues, and in particular, the orders of the past couple months. I'm quoting here some language from a recent complaint that your organization filed. The proclamation is in part a series of measures intended to achieve the goal of substantially shutting down congressionally authorized immigration to the United States. All of this is unlawful. Congress has already considered and rejected the immigration cuts the president seeks to implement unilaterally through the proclamation, unilaterally rewriting federal immigration laws. So the manner in which this is conducted is not a community conversation, right? This is not an engaging of where people are. It's something very different, and it threatens, I think, the bounds of what presidential authority is or ought to be. So I'm curious how you think about the fight it is on multiple levels and how more of the American public's view can be brought to bear when there's an administration that's out of whack.
That's such an important question, Adam, and also the discussion has been so enriching. I would say, speaking directly to what you were quoting, it is shocking to me how much over the last years the president has done through, presidential fiat or executive pen that is in direct conflict with carefully considered and frankly really hard to pass congressional legislation on immigration. And those pieces of legislation are hard to pass, in fact, because of the things that Ali and Krish have been talking about, right? Because to get something through both houses of Congress and signed by the president, you have to grapple with these questions of who are we, who do we aspire to be, what do we want the U.S. role in the world to be viewed as, and to consider a combination of economic factors, family unification factors, humanitarian assistance, and how we cooperate in matters of national security internationally. And so then to have the president come in and to start with what people thought was small, right? Oh, my family's not from the listed Muslim ban family, so maybe I don't have to pay attention to it. And then that same authority gets used to expand, and then there's a refugee ban. And then there is this, and before he did the massive legal immigration ban, there was a small ban on people who couldn't show that they could pay out of pocket for certain junk health insurance programs. And then we got the monster of the immigration ban and its impact. And as Krish was saying, even if we change administrations, the ability to undo this is going to take years and years and years because of the shutout effect and the way our systems have changed. One thing I want to pull up, and I think, Ali said so wisely, we get dragged into this deeply polarized debate about immigration. And it is important to balance the ideas of what do we want our system to promote, what values. But what I want to remind people is that the scope of the change that we've seen from this president touch all of us at the individual level because they've gone so broad. So let me just take off a few for you quickly. So I've had the honor of being part of the DACA litigation for many years, and sadly, even after the Supreme Court victory, which is a real watershed moment for the immigrants' rights movement to have a victory of that magnitude at the Supreme Court, we're fighting again because the president has tried to change it. You know, almost everyone who's listening to this probably knows a DACA recipient personally. And so we can all kind of calibrate, like, for me, for example, one of my son's teachers in elementary school is a DACA recipient. And it was very challenging while the litigation was happening and knowing she was teaching my son's class. And she wanted to know, will I still have a job? Will I be safe? And even if you don't know a DACA recipient, some of you are like me with this legal immigration ban. The other category of family-based immigrants who immigrants were cut out is siblings. So my mom is an immigrant from Canada, married my dad, who's a U.S. citizen. She's a U.S. citizen now, and an immigrant voter. But, very early on when we were born, her sister came. And she was like the other mother to me. She always lived, within walking distance of our house. And the president has decided to overwrite the congressional design that those family members matter. And so many of us can relate to, wait a minute, my aunties or uncles couldn't come. And even if none of that applies to you, you may be, or you like one of my clients who owns a robust landscaping business in Michigan. And for years has gone through the rigorous process of proving that there are no U.S. workers who would take certain seasonal jobs in the snow doing landscaping in Michigan, and is a job producer, right? Because for a decade has been able to bring in temporary workers who come in, do the work, produces continuous jobs for U.S. citizens around this business, which is at risk of bankruptcy and collapse due to the latest ban. And so what I want to say is the magnitude of the changes that we are left with will touch us all, but it may be in different ways. And that goes back to me to the identity question, which is, you may not know of certain changes, but the scale of its impact on your workplaces and your families and your communities is significant. And I think sometimes in this deeply polarizing debate, we forget to bring it back to that level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karen. And just a note also to the audience, as we are approaching the last 25 minutes or so, if you want to be adding your own questions to the discussion, please use the function at the bottom of your screen and we'll be reviewing some of those. Ali and Krish, I want to pick up on Karen's point and put maybe a broader question to either or both of you. But it really is this. So the lasting impact of some of these changes is not only the undoing of regulation. I mean, some of the bans, some of the executive orders could be theoretically easy, right? But some of the regulatory process is much harder. But actually, I'm concerned too about the change in behavior. And after the years of message that has been received, and now layering, for example, the proposed rulemaking around student visas and limiting their access to 2 years for up to 59 countries and making it harder to renew, just the collective message that this sends to an intending immigrant, to a student who's trying to come to the United States, and that those change behaviors and patterns could really outlast any of this policy. Be curious to have your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Krish.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's lessons that in the resettlement community, working with unaccompanied children, that we have learned I hate to call it complacency, but when you take the refugee resettlement program, a bipartisan program, Reagan resettled the highest number of refugees of any president. You had more refugees resettled under Republican administrations than Democratic administrations. And I think part of the strategy was that this was an accepted program that frankly didn't need to have public support, that it was perhaps better to have it kind of fly under the radar. And I think that this has been a real kind of awakening in terms of we need to build a base. And I think, related to Karen's, comments just now, part of that base can't be just on your unique issue, right? It can't be that we create this dynamic of zero sum where it's either we open up the southern border or we accept refugees. Even in the language communicated by the administration yesterday, the assumption underlying it was that it was zero sum. And America has always been able to, walk and chew gum. And so I think that is one lesson we have learned, that we need to lay a more affirmative, proactive narrative around immigration, because the xenophobia, the white nationalist language you're seeing, it doesn't end with this administration, even if the president doesn't get reelected. So I think that is one really critical lesson we've learned. We've also learned that it's really, yes, of course, it's important to talk about America's legacy as a nation, and the humanitarian and the moral imperative. But we've certainly learned in the last few years that the messengers matter. And so when we're able to put a business leader explaining the value of the immigrant population to a community, that helps. When we're able to put a bishop or a reverend out there explaining how for many Americans this is a matter of faith, it sometimes resonates when our pleas fall on deaf ears. And so I think that's where, for us, the last few years has been incredibly educational. And I hope that coming out of this, we don't forget those lessons.
Ali, I'd love to on that. Please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to ask you to pick up on that and also add an additional public opinion note that I don't believe you mentioned, which is a recent Pew Research survey that shows that eligible voters, and this is a question they've been asking for a very long time, do immigrants, are they more of a strength or a burden to the country, actually went up to record numbers in the last 4 years. In just 4 years, went from 46% saying strengthen up to 60%, and that is all voters. And that went up among shares of Republicans as well as Democrats. So putting that together with some of Krish's comments, I'd love to hear your response.
It's so there's I was last fall, I was speaking at the Texas Public Policy Foundation conference, and it's a very conservative organization, obviously out of Texas. And this is the first time at their policy conference they had a couple of panels on immigration. The first panel was on border, and it was like a packed room, right? And people were just very, very upset. Then the panel that I was on, it was moderated by a former congressman, and Mark Krikorian was on the panel as well. He's one of the kind of the leading anti-immigrant organizations. And he kind of went down his usual path of, for us to be pro-immigrant, we're just giving the country over to the United Nations, open borders, blah, 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 blah. And I've heard that shtick before. And I'm watching people's heads in the audience. And everybody's kind of laughing at his one-liners and kind of getting a kick out of it. And I kind of took a gamble. And when it was my turn to speak, I said, you know what? We all laugh at Mark Krikorian. He's makes us, his are funny. But he's also insulting all of us. And the point that I made to the room was that when our opponents are oversimplifying the immigration debate and saying, close the border, no more immigration, mass deportation, it caters to a segment of the American population. But there are more people than I think we realize that see immigration as a complicated challenge, and they're ready to have a complicated conversation to come up with a very nuanced solution. So again, in this room that was, 80% against our position at the forum, as soon as I was able to say, as soon as I was able to acknowledge the complexity of the challenge and to more or less tap into all of our aspirations to be smart, intelligent people, to have complicated conversations, they all started saying, okay, yeah, so what's the complicated solution? And you know what the best part about that panel is that Mark Krikorian never responded to my point. And I kept saying it over and over again. I'm not sure, Karen, if you ever, but it's like, when he feels like he has the upper hand, he'll keep responding. But when he doesn't want to talk about it, he just won't even go there. So my point here, and kind of pick up on what Chris is saying and what you're saying, Adam, is that yes, messenger is important. Yes, public opinion in some polls is trending our way. But I don't think that that should give us any reason to believe that there's a simple solution ahead. Because on the other side of COVID-19, tens of millions of Americans are going to remain without a job. And I guarantee you, opponents who right now are thrilled that the stock market is going up and would much rather have the American public forget about COVID-19, if our opponents are out of power, that is all they're going to talk about. So I think we have to anticipate the way that, the jujitsu that we're going to have to deal with in, hopefully, in a different context in the years ahead. And I just don't think we should assume that the numbers and the trends that we're seeing now are going to see us through on the other side of this. And we just have to be really thinking about what is the nuanced and complicated conversation we need to have with the public.
Mm-hmm. And coming back to the kind of tactics and the manner, I want to put to Karen another layer here as well. We now have reports that ICE is planning a show of force, right, kind of before the election, and kind of the use and abuse of federal authorities that are ostensibly immigration authorities, but really being used in ways that is intended to go far beyond. So I'd like to hear you weigh in on those matters as well, and if you could also share, knowing that there's a lot of actions that have been overstepping norms, if not legal bounds. The Supreme Court is obviously a hot topic. What do you see coming to a next court now that RBG is no longer there?
RBG, one of my sheroes. Great questions, Adam, as always. So on tactics and manner first, and then the High Court. So on tactics and manner, I think, obviously, I cannot countenance the notion that as we enter the final month before an election, that immigrants and what matters most to them, whether they can stay in this country or not, would be used as a riling up the base electoral issue, right? I want immigration enforcement that is smart, that is considered and thoughtful, not that is designed as a show of force, as you're saying. And certainly, what I would say about that, connecting it to what we've seen from President Trump, is that there are no tactics that are below the belt for this president when it comes to immigrants, unfortunately. And, I will give you two examples, and then what I think is the why. So we all were aware, right, of what happened in family separation in 2018. And there was a massive and bipartisan outcry against that as too far and absolutely below the belt. We don't rip children, including small children, from their parents as a show of force, as a deterrent mechanism. We use other mechanisms that don't long-term traumatize and torture families. But what people have forgotten is that family separation is continuing today. So no tactic is below the belt. We have brought lawsuits to stop this administration from orphaning children as young as 6 years old because their parents are here in the country, but they've decided that they can remove these kids from the parental care to a country where they have no parents and no adults who would take them in. It's mind-blowing to me that these are battles that we have to fight, and we have to fight them at the individual level, which is beyond the capacity of advocates to respond. But that's a tactic. I want to be clear. It's a tactic that is continued, that the administration has acknowledged that they believe if they separate families, it will change the inflow of humanitarian asylum seekers, which, I quibble with, but there has to be questions of how far are we willing to go, in the same way we ask ourselves. And again, I'm not trying to use hyperbolic language, but when you talk about separating children from any caregiver, it is, I believe, under any definition, torture. So Similarly, in the national security sphere, how far will we go in terms of what are we willing to use that is tantamount to torture? We have to ask that in the immigration sphere. And then you asked about the High Court, which is really, it's a hard subject. But this is how I feel as somebody whose value add is by engaging in the back and forth in the courtroom around our policies and the scope of rights for immigrants. It changes everything, of course, if the president's nominee is confirmed in the waning days of his presidency in a way that is absolutely historical, in a way that we don't have to look far back, was not allowed for President Obama on a much longer scope. But long term, I believe that even with a 6-3 court, changes in progress will continue to be made in the courtroom for immigrants, because those changes are never just about the judges who are sitting in the chairs and wearing the black robes. It is, in fact, my belief long term, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's belief, that our real change comes when the court is catching up to public opinion. And so I look back at what you said, Adam, the change in those key poll numbers. So if I have a 6-3 court, if I have a 5-4 court, I don't care. We're going to move forward, trying to do what Krish said, which is building a base of support for the values we hold dear on immigration. That is not one issue. That doesn't pit one set of immigrants against each other. And, I think that the late Justice Thurgood Marshall, when he was bringing cases for justice for Black Americans, faced much more hostile courts. We'll do the same.
It's a quick follow-up. Do you have any cases now, or are there cases you're watching that you think are headed to the court in the immigration space?
Oh, yes. Sadly, yes. I think that the case you quoted from, Adam, is destined for the Supreme Court because it's so broad and it's the ultimate test of presidential authority under the specific statute that he's using. I mean, if the president is reelected. Pardon me?
Oh, sorry, this is the June proclamation. I just was stating for the record.
The June proclamation, I think, is headed to the Supreme Court if President Trump has a second term. In addition, I think regardless of who the next president is, I think DACA will be headed back to the Supreme Court. And the reason is there's still a challenge brought by Texas and other states to the legality of DACA. And so I think that we have a long-term fight, whether we're in a Biden administration or a Trump 2 administration, around the scope of executive authority for programs like DACA.
Yeah, for sure. And we've seen just recently to the ruling on the fee rule, the immigration benefits fee rule from USCIS, partially predicated on the fact that the acting assistant secretary is not lawfully appointed. So we're going down several rabbit holes with that. Going back, I think we've talked a good bit on identity impact and kind of the range of kind of issues with which the American public are grappling and of multiple minds. Are there clearer policy solutions? I mean, so were there to be this broader majority of support that translated to a policymaking ability, let's say, are there easy answers? Or to Ali, to start with you, to your point, is it in part hard because it is complicated and people tune out and there aren't easy answers to fix the policy problems that are there?
Well, I think in the years ahead, let's think about whether it's this 2021 or the next administration after a second Trump term. How do we reimagine not just the immigration system, but actually how to advance immigration solutions? So there are a couple pieces of legislation that we worked on over the course of this current Congress that I think could be a template in terms of how to move forward. So one was the Kerry-Orozco Act. And this act would, if I remember correctly, would grant expedited citizenship to the immigrant family members of first responders killed in the line of duty. Now, we were able to, get the support of Republican members of Congress who would never touch an immigration bill. They just, you say immigration to some of these members, are like, they're gone, right? They're just turn around and run. But in the context of a first responders bill, it was a conversation they were willing to have. So, how do we find more opportunities like that to just start to begin this conversation with a member of Congress or their constituents of, okay, this is what immigration looks like in this context, and this is the value that it adds to your very specific community. That's one example. The other was the Healthcare Modernization Act. And this was by and large a function of kind of the national response to COVID-19. But the idea was to, with this particular piece of legislation, to make an effort to expand visa opportunities, legal work visa opportunities for parts of the healthcare workforce. Again, it wasn't necessarily framed explicitly as an immigration bill as much as it was a healthcare workforce piece of legislation. And I just think that, regardless of the outcome of this coming election or the elections ahead, we've got to be much more nimble of the way we're talking about these issues, the way that we are creating and taking advantage of legislative opportunities. And just to bring it back through to the membership and the audience of the Truman Center, I really strongly believe that, the national security component of these questions is going to become more and more important. I think that on the other side of COVID, we're going to see an increased amount of pressure on our border, on borders around the world. So from a national security perspective, what are the policies, who are the spokespeople that can really clearly lay out why it's important for the U.S. to have a constructive approach to refugee resettlement, immigration, the immigrants who are here already. And, it's just, I'm really, really, urging folks, who are watching this to kind of think in their own spheres about how their leadership within the national security community can be brought to bear on this issue.
I'd like to bring you in on this too, Chris, and starting with the observation. So at this conference tomorrow, Truman will be honoring Alexander Vindman for moral courage, himself a resettled refugee from Ukraine. Obviously, the story of his service in the White House is now legendary. But would love to hear your reaction to that idea of service, national security, and also the, what are the paths forward on policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as I started my comments highlighting, we do need to start understanding that immigration is a core part of our national security, whether it is how we ensure that we have the translators, interpreters, drivers that we need while the military is deployed abroad, whether it's in the soldiers that we need into our military forces here at home, but also just broader issues where, when I ran Let Girls Learn at the White House, we knew that educating girls in refugee camps was a matter of national security because it was a strategy of countering violent extremism. And so just to add on to Ali's comments in terms of where I think there are some policy opportunities in the future, I do think that there are a couple issues that, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to tackle. One is climate displacement. So we know that 2/3 of the migrants that we deal with today are as a result of the climate crisis. And so recognizing that as a reality is really going to come to a head. No country in the nation actually has a path for resettlement for climate refugees or climate displaced persons. Even the terminology is disputed, even though about 22.5 million people per year have been displaced in the last 10 years. This is not saying, oh, this is a projection for 2050. This is the reality we face at home, but it's also an issue that America faces when we talk about Native Americans who are, inhabiting the Ile de Jean Charles off the coast of Louisiana. We have American citizens who are getting federal taxpayer dollars to resettle because of sea level rise. And so this is an issue that I do think American policymakers are going to have to take on. And then the other issue I'll highlight is an underlying dynamic of what we see as the immigration system here at home, is the militarization, or basically the uh, putting brown and black persons in jail, oftentimes because there's a profit incentive. So when you look at the private prison companies, who thankfully were pushed out of the domestic prison system, as a product of criminal justice reform, they look to immigration as their new profit center. And so when you look at the fact that the vast majority of detainees in the immigration system sit in immigration detention centers run by for-profits, that Geo, Core Civic literally have made billions of dollars, just 1.8 billion of ICE contracts just in the past year, you realize that ending the kind of system we have today is ending the profiteering off of immigration. And so that is a dynamic, again, that I think there's a real opportunity if there is a new administration.
To unpack that further, I mean, is there opportunity in the necessary delayed awareness of and reckoning, frankly, of Black Lives Matter and the racial justice inequity that we've endured as a country for far, far too long, to really make policy changes in coalitions that are stronger today as a result of this awareness, and meeting common cause in some of these areas like private prisons and otherwise, that can really have a different justice outcome for so many more of our Americans and aspiring Americans?
It's a great question, so I'll follow up, but obviously I hope my colleagues will jump in. I'd say there is a huge opportunity in two ways. So one is just the fact that if we can frame this issue as not Democrats versus Republicans, but one of industry versus a reasonable policy of how we actually want to use taxpayer dollars, when you hear these arguments of, we can't fund this, that, or the other because we don't have the money to pay for it. When you look at the fact that, we've given these two companies alone $5.4 billion in the last few years, there's plenty of money. Now, of course, the fact that, you take Geo and their CEO gave the Republican Party $500,000, it suggests that maybe that will be a difficult argument to cast because of, campaign finance. But I do think there's an opportunity. The other piece of this is when you look at the crackdown and the deployment of CBP and maybe even some ICE officials to Portland, Oregon, to crack down on racial justice protests. This is the spillover effect, right? For experts like us in the immigration space, we have seen the abuse of enforcement officers on the southern border. This is just a matter of them being redeployed inland. And so this is where I hope that we can continue to join forces in solidarity, because I do think these issues share a real commonality in humanity.
We have just a couple minutes left, but I'd love to get Ali, you and Karen in on this point too.
I can start. I do apologize that you might hear a truck going by. This is our times of COVID. I totally agree with what Krish said. I think there's real opportunity and, in fact, an imperative for us to connect the dots between the struggle for racial justice, particularly for Black Americans, and what we're doing on immigration. I'll give one example as the truck passes by, which is, and it's somber, right? I have the privilege of working as part of a legal team that is responding and assisting some of the women who are subject to horrific medical abuses in a Georgia detention center, including some that were as severe as forced sterilization without their consent. And I say that in pause because you would think that I'm talking about something in our history. You would think that I'm talking, for example, about Tuskegee. And you would think that I was talking specifically, and again, I'm being really candid because I think it's important, about our shameful history of infecting Black Americans with disease in order to use them as guinea pigs. You would think that, but I'm not. I'm talking about something that has happened now. I'm talking about something that this week you saw the release of medical records confirmed by independent doctors in a New York Times story. And the reason is, again, I'm going back to what Chris just said. On our watch, under recent years, we have allowed the private prison system and the immigration detention system to blossom and grow. And that system treats people in a way that no human should be treated. This is the result. And so we have to do more. It's what Chris said before. We can't be single issue. We can't say, my issue is immigration as it relates to national security. We have to look at these intersections. And it really is a call for the immigration community to say, if we are going to work on what's happening to these women, which in some cases is forced sterilization, we need to do our work and connect to our Black brothers and sisters who have been doing this for decades.
Thank you, Karen. Ali, you have 15 seconds if you have a quick comment on this.
So I would just say, I think we have to kind of keep in mind the country that we want to be a part of, the country that we want our children or grandchildren to be a part of. And again, like I said earlier, in our communications, in our advocacy,
I'm sorry, folks.
Really try to build that coalition so that people can begin to reach those aspirations. So that's my 15 seconds. Thank you.
Amor sin fronteras, amor es love.
This all began when I read about a librarian who started a music festival at the border between the United States and Mexico. ¡Que viva México! He invited us to join him to sing, perform, and dance. And that wall built to divide us was transformed into something that unites us. I fell in love with this idea of people coming together using the primal connection of a Mexican folk music called son jarocho. Despierta, patria, despierta. Despierta, patria, despierta. This is not just a story. It's a vision of a world full of hope, friendship, and love.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda, President and CEO of the Truman Center for National Policy. I'm delighted to have all of you here today for a really special conversation with Truman Project board member Jake Sullivan and a longtime State Department colleague and mentor. It's great to have you here, Jake. Jake wears a number of hats. He is Senior Fellow at the Carney Endowment for International Peace and a Senior Policy Advisor on Joe Biden's presidential campaign. Jake served in the Obama administration as National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden and Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, as well as Deputy Chief of to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He was the Senior Policy Advisor on Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, and he helped lead the secret diplomacy that paved the way for the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. Sullivan has written commentary on U.S. foreign and domestic policy in a range of publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and Democracy Journal. Hi, Jake. Welcome. It's great to see you.
Hi, Jenna. Great to be here. And hi, everybody out there. I'm really happy to have the chance to be with you all today.
Well, I really wish we were together in the same room for so many reasons, but I'm glad that we were able to come together just to check in and talk about a number of things before us. I want to start off with the really important report that was just released from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I know you were a co-author of that report titled Making U.S. Foreign Policy Work Better for the Middle Class. Jake, I think, that captures so perfectly the conversation that we're trying to have here today as part of TruCon, where we're really breaking down those, I think, increasingly artificial barriers between our foreign policy imperatives and priorities and the fight at home to clean up Iraq and to do right by the American people. I'd love to know about the genesis of the report, which I believe was 2 years in the making. The timing seems particularly auspicious, and would love to hear a bit from you about some of those key findings.
Sure. So as you say, the report fundamentally examines the question of what we can do in respect to U.S. foreign policy to improve the way in which it delivers for the American middle class. And the report defines the American middle class the way that Pew, the Pew Research Center does, which is essentially median income between the 25th and 75th percentile across the country. And it started with a basic observation that I and several of my colleagues, including the primarily responsible for the report, Salman Ahmed, a former colleague from the Obama administration, had about our time serving in government, which is that U.S. foreign policy had paid insufficient attention to the impacts on working families here in the United States of the broad range of policies and strategies we were pursuing overseas. Most people would think of that in the context of trade, and of course, trade is an important part of it, and the report discusses that. But defense policy, how we think about our alliances, how we think about development and foreign aid, how we think about what our priorities are from the point of view of relationships and investments and alliances globally. And so what we did with this report was do case studies in three countries, in 3 states. Kind of feels like 3 different countries in a way, in Ohio, in Nebraska, and in Colorado, really trying to come to grips with every aspect of American foreign policy and how it actually impacts the lives of working people in this country. And then what are some steps we could take, changes in direction we could make that would improve the capacity for the foreign and defense policy of the United States to deliver for people. And we set out our findings and recommendations in the Carnegie report.
So I'd love to drill down just a little bit. I mean, I think it's, this is something in our time together at State Department, we talked a lot about. Tom Shannon was famous for talking about the need to make the foreign policy workings public, to draw people into the American story and to demystify the work of the department and so many other agencies that lead together on foreign affairs. With respect to trade, I mean, so much of the work of diplomacy has been to advance bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, and has also been to advance U.S. corporate interests overseas and to defend them. How do you reconcile that with a reality in which we have a shrinking middle class, in which a lot of folks really aren't feeling the benefits of globalization? And we know that from so many studies that gap between rich and poor is really only growing. So what does that mean for existing trade agreements? And what do you and your colleagues think is the imperative to do things differently in the future?
Jenna, it's a fantastic question. And I think back to my time at the State Department, serving under Secretary Clinton and serving with Tom Shannon and many other incredible colleagues. And in that job, commercial diplomacy was a big part of what we did, which was advocating on behalf of American companies who were seeking to invest overseas. And when I left, it occurred to me that we had not spent sufficient time thinking about the extent to which our commercial diplomacy efforts, let alone our trade negotiation efforts as a broader US government, were really drilling down on the question, what is the American economic interest? You see, it's not just some big undifferentiated concept. There are always going to be choices that you make in terms of where your priorities lie. And frankly, in respect to commercial diplomacy and with some of the free trade agreements that we pursued over the past few decades, too much emphasis has been placed on essentially making the world safe for American corporate investment. That is not a bad end. It can have a meaningful positive jobs impact here in the United States, but it's an insufficient end because it doesn't really drill down on what should, in my view, be the core economic interest proposition of the United States, which is sustaining and growing the bedrock foundation of America's economic growth and competitiveness, which is our middle class. And so part of the argument in this report is to adjust trade policy and commercial diplomacy and every other aspect of our international economic engagement to prioritize the positive impact that it can have on the well-being, the jobs, and the wages of middle-class families in the United States.
So how do you square that? I mean, I totally agree. And, I think back to like my own time at Embassy Panama and, you go and you help these companies deal with disputes. I mean, that was so much a part of the constituency that we dealt with. And, you didn't get calls from farmers in Iowa or people who had lost their jobs. There was not that kind of voice that was present in the way that you suggest. But how do you reconcile the multinational corporate interests with the distributional misalignment that exists for many Americans at home? Which is to say, how do you thread that needle and really operationalize that in a policy context?
Well, for one thing, what you don't do is decide to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to say the solution here is just to end all international trade or international economic engagement. Not by a long shot. The United States should be engaged in the world. We're 5% of the world's population, 95% of potential customers, therefore, are outside the US borders. We ought to be able to compete effectively in the international economy, trade with the rest of the world on a playing field that is genuinely level. And if we do, it will succeed in raising the fortunes of people in the United States, middle-class people, and raising the fortunes of people around the world as well. And it can be a genuine win-win proposition. But that requires a realignment of how we think about our priorities and our obligations as a country. And that includes how corporate America thinks about its priorities and obligations. One of the big challenges that has emerged in the past few decades is this notion that only the shareholders matter, that the entire orientation of a CEO or the corporate decision-making is about increasing the shareholders' bottom line. And fundamentally, if we don't return to an idea of stakeholder capitalism, where the workers matter, communities matter, the country matters, then this misalignment that you've just described is going to grow. But there is a way for corporations to both profit and grow and do the things they do, and also better serve and invest in their workers, communities, and country. And really, this gets to the point that has been reinforced throughout this conference. That's as much about quote unquote domestic policy as it is about quote unquote foreign policy, but I use those quotation marks because really the line between domestic and foreign policy is deeply blurred.
Yeah, and to your point, as we think about this, I think, from our own time in government, and in a number of respects, while at one and the same time, foreign policy has really advocated on behalf of large U.S. businesses overseas, a number of policies from state, from USAID, have been very progressive when it comes to advocating for economic development that is diverse and inclusive within other countries. So in some respects, the right and the left hand aren't talking to each other, and maybe there are some lessons there. I feel like this gets to one of the other findings of this report, I'd love to hear more from you.
One brief thing about that, Jenna, that I think, because it's a profound point. And I don't think that the reason why there's this disconnect between the kind of progressive nature of our approach within other countries and less so in our country is because of bad faith or because the people who are driving this don't profoundly care about people here. They do. It's frankly about silos. It's about how our government is set up in a way where the folks working in foreign policy are essentially told, don't worry, we'll take care of all the distributional consequences here. You go out and set the trade and development agenda, and we'll make sure that in the domestic side, we're dealing with the fairness and equity questions and, how to compensate those who've lost out and so forth. And those of us who worked in foreign policy kind of went on assuming that was all being taken care of. And frankly, leaving government and having the opportunity to really dig into what was happening in the United States with respect to inequality and lack of social mobility, it became clear that that wasn't happening here. And so, a fundamental proposition that not just the report makes, but that, I feel particularly passionately about, and I know that Truman has been engaged in, is that those of us who work in the national security field have to concern ourselves with the domestic impacts of everything we do. We have to become champions for a progressive domestic economic agenda, even as we are champions for the kinds of questions related to fairness and equity and opportunity around the world. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
it was just, I thought what you were saying was just so important.
Yeah, no, 100%. And that's exactly where I was headed. I mean, we talk, and we have a large audience joining us here today, not all of whom have been living in this world their entire lives. And so, if you can unpack this for us a little bit, talk about breaking down some of these silos. What are we really talking about here? I'd love your thoughts on what that really means in terms of the architecture of the way these decisions are made, but also how we change that. This would not be the first time we've really tried to, rearrange the deck chairs on this outmoded 1947 architecture that is our national security institutional establishment. Hasn't worked very well. A lot of folks have tried. It feels like we're at a tipping point because there is so much of a recognition domestically that there's an imperative, but would love your thoughts both on what we're really talking about when we talk about these silos and why that crosstalk is so hard, and also how we move past it.
Sure. And, the U.S. government is such a sprawling enterprise that there's not a single answer to that question. There's a number of steps that we need to be able to take effectively. I'll identify three that are illustrative, but not comprehensive. The first is a procedural process one, and that is to make sure the National Security Council within the White House is much more deeply integrated with both the National Economic Council and the Domestic Policy Council. That has to be formalized in terms of who's sitting at the table for big decisions across the board in terms of setting priorities, in terms of budget and resource, in terms of broad-based strategy, the whole 9 yards. The second is about taking specific top-line priorities and staffing them out in a way that cuts across the domestic and foreign divides. China is a great example of this. We've thought of U.S.-China policy as basically a foreign policy question. It's the South China Sea, it's issues related to cyber theft, it's questions related to human rights. But at the end of the day, the core foundation of our China strategy has to be what we are doing to invest in our own competitiveness. And therefore, a meeting on U.S. strategy towards China should have as many people at it talking about everything from infrastructure and innovation and immigration, to workforce development and education as it does folks, who come from the traditional bilateral relationship, stewardship part of the decision-making process. And then third, when it comes to the defense budget, I think everybody would acknowledge that we need to stop spending as much money on some of the legacy platforms, some of the old line systems, and redirect that funding towards more modern security uses in technology, artificial intelligence, and the like. But if you say that at 30,000 feet, actually trying to execute it is much harder, because if you're going to cut some, defense program to put the money into some other defense program, that's going to have a jobs impact in a community in America. And it's not good enough just to do it and say, well, we hope those folks will be taken care of. So there needs to be integration as well in terms of what our long-term investment strategy is to deal with the fact that shutting down a plant or shutting down a base is going to have a massive impact on a community. And it's not good enough to say, well, we'll send some adjustment assistance and take care of it all. And that's also something the report really gets into, is how dependent so many communities are on our defense budget. It is our form of industrial policy. And if we want to make adjustments in that, it has to be done in a way that integrates economic development strategy with our strategy for defense budget reform.
I mean, it really is striking. I mean, I think what we're saying here is that the reality for folks all around this country is that government isn't, that the structures and the policies and the procedures aren't meeting the reality, right? Most people experience China because they have a Huawei phone in their pocket. They don't know about the South China Seas and the Senkaku Islands and, you know, some of these other elements, and that disconnect makes it harder to talk to folks outside of the Beltway, certainly, about some of these issues. And so as the report goes on, you talk about the need to build a new political consensus, which I think is so clearly tightly tied to this notion of breaking down these silos. How do we do that? And how do you get started? I mean, Truman's got chapters all around the country. We see this stuff all the time. Economic development means one thing in Michigan. It means an entirely other thing in San Francisco. So how do you reconcile some of that and get that word out?
Look, there's no easy answer on this. A lot of folks have been breaking their pick at trying to deal with the get out into the country and really have a deep, sustained dialogue about our foreign policy and national security. And it's a really big undertaking. I guess I would just say two things, which are not a complete solution, but can help point us in the right direction. The first is to recognize this is not merely a communications challenge. This requires a recognition that there are shortcomings in the way we've been doing things and we've got to adjust them. So it's not just explaining better to the American people, it's about actually responding to their correct instinct that we've been miscalibrated in some of these ways that we've just been talking about. And then the second is it's a long-term project. It's not just something you can do by helicoptering in and saying, hey, think of it this way. It requires exactly the kind of grassroots, bottom-up type investment that Truman's been making to build conversations from within communities and then connect those communities in a broader network nationwide. And frankly, I think that the basic model that Truman has offered on this is going to be incredibly important going forward. And I would argue that, as Truman has really expanded its aperture beyond very core national security issues to questions like climate, it should keep going in that direction and be thinking about economic equity, racial equity, other issues that have traditionally had more of a domestic dimension, but are fundamental to an effective and principled and progressive national security strategy going forward.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment, Jake. Truman came out and said in the aftermath of George Floyd that Black Lives Matter, that we have this moment where we really need to come to terms with this structural racism within our policies. I think so much of what you have spoken about gets to a lack of diversity within government. Folks who have maybe come from a corporate background, or their circles are corporate, or people who have not come from rural environments. It's one of the reasons we're so excited to have Senator Murphy tomorrow to talk about the City and State Diplomacy Act, precisely because we see this need for more and more ties between communities. How do you think about diversity within the national security community? And what do you see as some of the knock-on effects from the absence of that diversity? And how do you think we start getting there, especially given an opportunity in November?
It's a huge challenge in the national security space, bigger than it is even in other policy spaces, and it's a challenge everywhere. But I think it's especially acute in foreign policy and national security. Racial diversity, gender diversity, diversity of background, diversity of geography, diversity of upbringing and training. All of these are just the gap between where we are and where we need to be is far too great. Now, there have been a number of organizations and efforts over the last few years that have stood up, some entirely dedicated to the proposition of diversity, some like Truman that have evolved a high priority to place on it. And so I think the arrow is definitely pointing in the right direction. But I would argue the single biggest consequence of a lack of diversity is that we have failed to actually properly define what national security is. We have had a cribbed, narrow definition that's been built around a kind of longstanding, kind of old white guy tradition of security studies, nuclear weapons, kind of the hard stuff. And serving for Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, I sort of saw this acutely, that her attempt to emphasize everything from development to civil society to women's rights was seen as all very nice, but kind of like not real diplomacy, not real foreign policy. It's sort of the extracurricular stuff. And I think that as we get more diverse voices from across the range of the elements of diversity we've talked about, we will broaden the definition of national security to the things that belong under its umbrella. And that goes for issues related to racial equity. It goes for issues related to global and public health. It goes for issues related to environmental justice. It goes for issues related to forms of insecurity that breed instability or conflict or violence or grievance and all the rest. And some of the blind spots that I had and other blind spots I have and don't see right now, and maybe in 5 years will. But the broader blind spots from the quote unquote national security community have emerged in part because we have not had a sufficiently diverse set of voices at the table being able to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to remind our viewers that we're accepting your questions. You can do so at the bottom of the screen, and we'll start to queue those up. Jake, I'd be remiss if we didn't get to Iran for a bit here. You were a central figure in helping to bring Iran to the table, a big part of the negotiations, what feels like a lifetime ago. We now have a new term of art in our vernacular, snapback sanctions. Can you talk to us a little bit about what these latest unilateral sanctions from the U.S. mean, what it means in terms of altering the threat environment from Iran, the damage to the economy? I mean, European partners largely laughed at a lot of these sanctions. What does it mean for what's left of the deal? And, how would a Biden administration kind of, pick this up? What's left and what's the smartest move going forward?
It's kind of amazing when you think about it. We had a deal in place that was working, that had put Iran's nuclear program in a box. Iran was complying with the terms of that deal, according to American intelligence, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And basically, the Trump administration said, we can get a better deal. We just have to go back to sanctions, and then Iran will come to the table, put their hands up, and do as we ask. So the Trump administration put out a list of 12 demands. Mike Pompeo gave a speech in 2018 laying out these demands, and they're 0 for 12. And Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon today than they were when the deal was in place. And as you say, America's isolated. Our allies are laughing at us and basically saying, go take a hike when we tried to reimpose some of the sanctions under the terms of the Security Council resolution that codified the deal. So going forward, the first thing that we have to do is put it to Iran to basically say, look, if you're prepared to return to your commitments under the deal, we will as well. And in that context, that will be a foundation upon which we will drive a hard bargain on a follow-on agreement that deals with the longer term questions around the Iran nuclear program and puts this thing on a solid footing, long into the future. To me, it's not rocket science. It's doing what we did: hard-headed diplomacy with our allies and partners, with the rest of the world on our side, extracting from Iran the set of commitments that we need to be able to look the American people in the eye and say, Iran will never be permitted to get a nuclear weapon. And this deal and this diplomacy has prevented them from doing that. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that negotiating follow-on agreement, that negotiating anything with the Iranians, especially in the aftermath of the last 4 years, it's not going to be a purely straightforward proposition. But if we hang in there with clear eyes and with a strong set of partners at our side, I'm confident that we will be able to put America on a much better footing when it comes to the question of the Iranian nuclear program than we've been able to do today.
It's stunning to think about one of the first, major events of 2020 being the killing of Soleimani and what the year has brought for both Iran and the United States with respect to the policy environment. We have a question on China. Our questioner reminds us that today is China's National Day. And that a year ago we were witnessing the throes of the Hong Kong protest movement, which this year has brought far fewer people, due in no small part to the really stringent, many would say oppressive national security law that was imposed in June, and the government citing COVID restrictions to limit protests. When we think about China and think also of the recent Hillman piece in Wall Street Journal today saying Belt and Road, totally overhyped, not going as well as anybody thinks, not as strategic as most would allow. What is the framing on China that is appropriate? When we think about the breadth and complexity of the relationship, how do you balance at one and the same time, recognizing that China is doing things that are directly in contrast with American interests, but that there's a really broad, textured relationship, especially on the economic side, that deserves and merits cooperation? How do you make that argument in a way that cuts through some of the noise on this? And is some of the projection on the adversarial nature of the relationship creating a self-fulfilled prophecy? I mean, are we stoking the fires of conflict for treating it that way? How do you kind of balance the enormity of that relationship?
Look, this is not easy because it is a big, messy, sprawling, complex relationship. And even beyond that, it touches on so many aspects of our approach to the world more broadly that there is no kind of single, simple formula for dealing with this immense challenge. I guess I would say three really important fundamental things. The first is that competing effectively, firmly, with vigor, with effectiveness, to me does not require sliding into confrontation and conflict. We can do that in a hard-headed way where we put ourselves in a position to succeed economically, technologically, politically, ideologically in the world without turning this into a new Cold War. And we should make no bones about the fact that we're going to have to compete hard. We're going to have to push back hard on certain aspects of China's behavior, and that should not necessarily translate into the great sort of twilight conflict of our time. Second is we should see no trade-off between competing vigorously on the one hand and working together with China where it's in our interest on the other hand. We shouldn't go soft on trade abuses or human rights abuses to gain China's favor on some other set of issues, because it's frankly in their interest too to work on climate change and global health and nuclear proliferation and global economic stability. So we should be perfectly prepared to walk and chew gum at the same time, compete hard and then work with China where it's in our interest to do so. And that set of issues I just laid out is part of that agenda. Climate and global health being at the top of it is two urgent things to work with China on as we go forward. And then I guess the third point is we cannot lose sight of our values. You look at what the Chinese Communist Party has done with respect to a deeply repressive term, concentration camps in Xinjiang, the steps that it's egregious, abusive steps it's taken with respect to Hong Kong, the surveillance state it's created that is crushing the whatever little freedom its citizens had before. The United States needs to be prepared to speak out strongly against that. We currently have a president who refuses to do so. Joe Biden would be a different kind of president when it comes to that. And these three pillars, competing effectively, working with China where it's in our interest, always standing up for our values, those are legs of a stool upon which you can build an effective China strategy. And then, the last point I would make here, that goes to the first 25 minutes of the conversation you and I have just had, is at the end of the day, our ability to effectively compete and win in the 21st century vis-a-vis China or anyone else fundamentally comes down to investing in ourselves and the sources of our own strength, in our economy, in our people, in our democracy. And that is why the balance between, or the separation between domestic and foreign policy is something we need to break down.
Yeah, absolutely. Susan offers a big question. She asks, does a new progressive vision for foreign policy mean that the U.S. must come to terms with the fact that the so-called end of the American century is here? I would add texture to that to just add, Jim Goldgeier penned a recent foreign affairs article talking about kind of, no longer atop, but we're now alongside. I think implicit within this is the question of, does that, recognizing that the world has changed, recognizing what the last near 4 years have meant for U.S. standing, how do you approach global leadership and convening? And is it different? And what does that look like in this new environment? And how much of that do you see?
So I still believe passionately that the United States has unique attributes and capabilities, unique among great powers, that create a circumstance in which we can, if we put our minds to it and operate in good faith and with more effectiveness than we have in recent years under this administration, we can play a critical leadership role in the world. Now that doesn't mean being on top and directing the activities of other sovereign nations. What it means is catalyzing and mobilizing collective action on the big challenges of our time. It means agenda setting and driving the conversation around the rules of the road in critical areas like trade and technology. It means providing a good example to the rest of the world, both from the point of view of our own model at home and with respect to how to operate as a responsible global citizen. These are all things that are within our power if we choose to act in an effective and responsible way. And so, no, I don't believe that we've reached the point where the United States is just another country. I don't. I mean, the United States has unique capabilities to rally the world on climate, on global health, on anti-poverty programs, on dealing with the challenge of nuclear proliferation, so much else. And there is no other country, and I certainly don't believe China represents a credible alternative to the United States in this respect. Now, the nature of our leadership will have to be different than it has been in past decades. Our willingness to allow others to step up and take the lead on certain issues will have to be greater. But no, fundamentally, I believe the United States continues to occupy a distinctive and critical role in the international system, and that our unwillingness to actually step up and serve that role has hurt the security and prosperity of the American people and has hurt the possibility of a stronger, more just, more vibrant international system as well. And I make no bones about that. And that's not to whitewash the challenges and the mistakes and the screw ups or the very fact of Donald Trump as our president, but it is to say that if we get our wits about us, we can and we should play that kind of role going forward.
I agree. It's a tough balance though, right? Because there has to be, don't you think, some recognition that we've got work to do to bring credibility to some of these issues, democracy promotion, human rights, the rule of law. But I also firmly believe that if we wait until we're batting 1,000 across the board, we're never going to be able to hold any other country accountable. You're never fully ready to be a champion on every issue.
Yeah, it's you're absolutely right. And my view on this is that a recognition of our own shortcomings and imperfections, a willingness to say we are working at that as steadily and effectively as we can, a humility about our limitations. These are not signs of weakness, they're actually signs of strength in our capacity to ask the same of other countries, to do better and be better. But I also don't think that we should allow for paralysis. I don't think we should be so kind of hopeless about the messed up situation we find ourselves in and say, well, I guess we just can't do it, because a lot rides on us stepping up. For the American people, a lot rides on it. For the world, a lot rides on it. And so, I think having that balance of humility and audacity it's an important balance to strike. But we cannot, in my view, there's as much danger in being overly restrained and saying, well, we just can't do anything, as there is in stepping up and trying to play a critical role on these critical issues despite our imperfections.
Well, that's a great point. So Raj has a question. He says, it's incredibly appreciative. Thanks for the great scope and knowledge. Where do you include the impending global climate crisis with problems being addressed as it seems fundamental and foundational? This seems yet another great example of the need to disrupt that domestic policy, foreign policy divide. We need look no further than the ash that has come to DC all the way from the West Coast in those fires. What does that look like for government? How should we be thinking about rejoining a Paris? And within that, there is a lot of responsibility, I think, for large American corporations. What can be done at this point? Because I think, are we not moving into a place of mitigation and adaptation and not just prevention? Where do we go forward?
So first, I will say that, having done quite a bit of work for the vice president on his economic recovery agenda, his Build Back Better agenda over the past 6 months, and I know this isn't a question about Joe Biden specifically, but it's a little bit the prism I'm thinking about it through, because it's been my experience over the course of 2020. He's put climate and addressing the climate crisis and clean energy at the core of his overall theory of economic recovery. How we drive job creation in this country is by managing an effective transition to a clean energy infrastructure, a clean energy economy. And so for him, the dealing with the immediate crises we are facing right now includes putting climate front and center. And that goes not just for domestic investments, but for an approach globally. Because of course, the United States is 15% of the world's emissions, which means we've got to be contributing to deal with the other 85%. And that involves a number of different steps. I'll just identify a couple of them. First, not just rejoining Paris, but elevating our own commitments under Paris and getting the other major emitters to elevate theirs. Second, working with the rest of the world on developing breakthrough technologies that can be fundamentally disruptive going forward, above and beyond the technological advances we've already seen. Third, ending global fossil fuel subsidies, not just in this country, but everywhere as we go forward. The IMF has done some work on this, but there needs to be an impetus to push this forward. And then fourth, actually holding China accountable. They've come out with this big proposal around 2060 and net zero emissions and so forth. But as we speak, they're using the Belt Road Initiative as a means of outsourcing pollution. And so I think there are steps that we need to take to be able to embed and inject climate into both trade strategies and development strategies that holds emitters like China accountable, as well as holding ourselves accountable. So those are some of the things that have to be at the core of what we do going forward. And climate's going to be one of those issues where almost no matter what the question is in the national security space, great power competition, transnational threats, instability, poverty, migration, climate's going to be a critical piece across the board. And so we have to treat it as such and integrate it into every dimension of our national security decision making.
Yeah, I mean, it's having a climate lens, right? It's having an energy lens in the way that we think and approach these problems. Jake, this is not an awesome time for those of us who care about human rights, democracy, the rule of law, the strength of our own image abroad. We've seen the Chicago Council's polling on this. We see what our longtime allies think about how we're doing. It's a tough time for this country. Domestically, a lot of people are hurting. We've lost 200,000 plus lives to COVID, far outpacing the death rate of any other country in the world. Amidst all of that, as we kind of close on our time together, would love to hear your thoughts on what really gives you hope, what keeps you going, and what is motivating, and what you see really as the opportunity.
Well, first of all, what gives me hope, perhaps more than anything else, is that even in the face of a president who has disgraced the office and set us back in so many ways in terms of our standing in the world, in terms of hollowing out the economy for working people in this country and the ghastly response to the COVID crisis, you look at the range of folks who are stepping up at the state and local level, in civil society, people who are running for office who never thought about doing so before and winning, the range of diverse voices that are emerging. I mean, the energy has simply been incredible in the public sphere, increasingly among responsible private sector actors in every aspect of civic life. You can point to new types of innovative ways to deal with the big challenges that we face, and that is just awesome. And Truman has been around since long before Donald Trump, but it's an organization that I think can hit an absolutely new stride, and is doing so under your leadership and under the broad-based kind of collective leadership of this network, by being part of that fabric that's saying, you know what, in the face of so much darkness coming out of the White House and out of DC, we can inject some light into so many of these challenges and make real progress. And we have, in the past few years, made forms of progress on everything from climate to equality to what we're seeing in terms of the protests around racial equity and the eye-opening response of the American public on those issues. So I believe that there is a huge chance now for us to make big gains socially, economically, across the board. Part of it is about beating Donald Trump. And part of it is about all of us, continuing to lift up the voices of folks who are trying to build rather than destroy in this country.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. As you note, so many of the Black Lives Matter protests were inspired around the world by what happened here at home. Important to remember how much power people have in this moment to show that America can stand up in times of need. Jake, a real pleasure having you. We thank you so much for spending time with us and your support to Truman. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Jenna. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Well, folks, That's a wrap for us. Thank you for joining us for our first day of TruCon. We are back tomorrow, same place, same channel, and you can join us tomorrow at 12 noon on the dot. We'll be thrilled to give Lieutenant Colonel retired Alexander Vindman the first ever Truman Award for exceptional courage in public service, presented by the truly wonderful Michelle Flournoy. Thank you so much for joining us today. Follow us alongside at Truman Center and online at trumancenter.org. And the hashtag is hashtag TruCon20. I'm Jenna Ben Yehuda, and that's a wrap for us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.